We have lots of things to figure out today. At least being able to make sure that everyone can hear us. Again, I'm Adrian Scott Fine. I have the privilege of serving as the president and CEO for the Los Angeles Conservancy, but in my real role is doing whatever Cindy tells me to do. And that is serving as the chair for their advocacy committee, used to be on the board, and really support what the California Preservation Foundation is doing. It is our voice for statewide preservation issues, certainly around legislation and certainly around housing, which that's the reason you're all in this room today, is because we're all having conversations in our communities about where does housing interact with preservation? What's the nexus? How can we be doing this better? And how do we work in the community of where it's very easy to put us in either a YIMBY, yes to my backyard, or a NIMBY, not in my backyard. And I always say, I think most preservationists probably fall into the MIMBY, the maybe in my backyard community, if there's good planning and thoughtful design, and it's thinking about the heritage assets that exist in our communities. Although that's easier said than done as we're talking about this, certainly in the face of a lot of legislation and even in the current session. So today is really about all this coming together, looking at how we're doing it in some communities in California and even beyond, and being solution oriented, and talking about what can we be doing, how do we interact with some of this legislation, and how do we get smarter and make sure that we're at the table when decisions are being made in our communities, as well as at the state level. Easier said than done, but it's something we all need to be doing. And that's why it's so important to be here in Sacramento. Why we had Advocacy Day yesterday is that people need to hear the voice of preservationists, especially around this pressing issue of housing with that. So with that in mind, think about proactive, positive, what we can be doing, looking at solutions, and we're all really good as preservationists about problem solving. This is a massive problem to solve. So think of the taking that on in terms of the opportunity about what we could be doing and doing it better. So with that, I want to turn it over to our fearless leader, Cindy Heitzman.
Thank you, Adrian. Thank you, Adrian. Thank you all for being here today. This is something that we feel very passionately about at CPF, and I'm sure every preservationist is feeling the same. We have a problem before us and we need to be part of the solution. So this is definitely looking at solutions and how we can help solve, be at the table, and also bring forward some of the practices that we've done. So that's what we've done with this program, is we are looking at housing kind of from top to bottom, looking at the legislative mandates, what's driving legislation, looking at how it's being played out in cities and in the administration of housing law with HCD, and looking at how that's happening again at the city levels, both within the housing divisions within housing enforcement within the cities, and then looking at some case studies that we've put together on how different entities, jurisdictions, developers have addressed this. What are we doing that's working, and what can we do that perhaps we haven't thought of? So that's what we want to do today. And the idea is to get you thinking and to, again, think about solutions and thinking about our role in this. Just in terms of the structure today, we'll begin with some presentations. We're going to have the presentation broken really into 3 segments, talking about the intersection of housing and historic preservation with a look at the legislative and the administrative aspects of housing, looking at strategies for increasing density in historic districts. Each segment will have a Q&A program, and then at the end, we're going to break into groups and do some problem solving and looking at barriers, what are the barriers to increasing density, and then we're going to be reporting out. This is also being broadcast out. I'm pleased to say we had about 200 attendees sign up online. So thank you all out there in the ether for participating today. And with that, I'm going to introduce our first speaker, who's going to give us that legislative perspective. And actually, let me stop for a moment. If you have the app, the conference app, there should be speaker bios. So we're not going to be reading out bios, but I want to introduce our speakers and give them plenty of time to speak. And with that, I'm very pleased and honored to invite Assemblyman Matt Haney, the chair of the Assembly Housing Committee.
All right, well, good afternoon, preservationists. I had the opportunity to go and speak at a conference that you all had down in Los Angeles last year, and I was on a panel there, and that's where I came to the understanding and got to come out as a preservationist myself. So you can say that the chair of the Assembly Housing Committee is a proud preservationist. Anyone who I think loves our state and loves what makes it special, loves its culture, its character, should be a preservationist. Should want to maintain the history and the beauty and the contributions and what makes us unique. And I live in San Francisco. I live in downtown San Francisco, right on Market Street. I live just a few blocks from a dozen historic buildings, that some of which were built around the turn of the century, in the turn of the 20th century. And I live on the same block as the Warfield Theater. And when I go around my city and I think about what makes it special, why people want to be there, those are the things that I look to. It's our architectural uniqueness. It's coming to a place and going, this is uniquely and distinctly San Francisco, our neighborhoods, the various ways in which you can see the folks who've immigrated there, and how they've contributed and how you can still live that history in our city. And I know that every part of California has a similar story. And so we have to, as we think about growing as a state, as we think about meeting the challenges that we have as a state, we have to think about how we do it while preserving that character and those contributions. And I think there's probably no more urgent challenge, although these days there's a new urgent challenge every day for our state and the country, but no more urgent challenge, I think, in the minds of most people in California than our housing crisis. We have one of, if not the most expensive housing markets in the country. Our residents take on a greater burden when it comes to their housing costs than any other state. That's true for both renters and homeowners. I'm one of now just 10 renters in the state assembly. When I first got here, there were just 3 of us, 3 out of 120, actually out of the entire state legislature. And renters are taking on a greater and greater burden, spending more of their income on rent. And the same is true for homeowners. And so we have this urgent need to build a lot more housing and bring down the cost of housing. And California obviously and frankly hasn't done enough. Well, the truth is that doesn't need to be done at the expense of historic preservation. In fact, there are many ways in which we can have tremendous opportunities for win-wins here. There are, as we know, many, many thousands of historic buildings, whether they have that designation or not, that have certain aspects of them that need to be maintained and should be maintained, but they also can be adapted and renovated and modernized in various ways so that they can be used by folks to live. We have a huge opportunity right now that we are missing in our state because we haven't taken advantage of the changes in laws and incentives like the one that we worked on together with the historic tax credit to be able to make that possible. And if you go around, as I have this past year, I went to 10 of our larger downtowns. You see a similar story all over the state. Nearly 30% vacancy levels. We're not coming back in terms of the levels of office occupancy, and California is even having a higher rate than many other cities. Huge office vacancies, often retail vacancies, downtowns that are sort of struggling to find their identity. And in most cases, a lot of really gorgeous, incredible historic buildings that are not being fully utilized. And the opportunities for them to be able to be maintained and preserved with investments, but also in ways that allow them to be adapted for housing or other types of use, I think is a tremendous and in fact an essential opportunity for us as a state. I was just talking with some of my friends from San Francisco, and the reality is if we need to build a few more million units of housing, the first place that we should be looking is where it's possible with existing buildings. It is more sustainable. It is cheaper in some cases. It is much more better for our climate and for our reducing emissions to utilize existing buildings where possible for adaptive reuse. And so that's a conversation that I've been so excited to be able to have with you all, and to do it in a way that doesn't throw the baby out with the bathwater, actually puts preservation as central as part of the conversation. How do we make sure that we have ways to identify how to do that well, how to protect as we do it, and where it's possible? Because when people live in historic buildings or historic districts, it is an incredible experience for them. They protect that place, they enrich it, they make sure it's utilized. And when historic assets are actually used by people for whatever reason that is, I think that has to be a part of our goal, and it can help us accomplish so many of the things and meet many of the challenges that we have as a state. I would also say many of these buildings are in places where there's infrastructure, where they were built for people to be around transit in some cases, around ways to get there in terms of transportation. And so for us to go out and build brand new stuff way out in the middle of nowhere, that can often lead to sprawl, it can lead to more emissions, it can lead to a whole set of other social challenges. So I do believe that we can protect the areas that should be protected, the neighborhoods that should be protected, the culture that should be protected, the character of those places and neighborhoods, and also find ways to be able to convert and modernize and renovate buildings that can be utilized, especially for housing. It's been a huge priority for me in working with you all. We authored the historic tax credit together, and we're going to get that passed. And ultimately, that needs to be a lot bigger than it is. $50 million is not anywhere near enough. We were talking about the potential if this was operated similar to the way the federal one did, where people could actually draw from it in a more consistent basis and at a scale. Imagine the projects that we would see all over our state. Imagine the types of theaters and housing buildings, affordable housing, cultural assets protected and built in ways that people could fully utilize. And so that's also the vision that we have to maintain for this. Every dollar that we invest in that historic tax credit, it brings huge, huge returns, not only in terms of jobs, but in terms of our state's heritage, its history, and what makes it special. We've also been working together on AB 507, which is the Office to Housing Conversion Bill, where again, we put the conversation about how to protect up front. We didn't shy away from that. We didn't say, no, we're just going to not listen to folks who understand how to do this and the right way to do it. We're going to actually make sure you all are at the table as we're talking about how to do this the right way. What should those conversions look like? How do we determine how to protect aspects of buildings that need to be protected, and also make sure that when you do those changes, that adaptive reuse, that we do it the right way with the right standards. So we need to have a renaissance of protection, but it also can be a protection through use wherever possible. Because what I see now is a state that is changing. It's changing in ways that we need to grow, that people are changing the way they work. With remote work, we're not having these huge office buildings. We have a tremendous need to build housing and other assets, but we can do it using a lot of what we already have. And right now, the incentives are not there. The commitment and policy is not there. And I think far too often, there are folks who are seeing these things in conflict rather than seeing the opportunities for a win-win. So I want to thank you all for your leadership and continued partnership. I am a very strong housing advocate, clearly, but as a San Franciscan, as someone who really believes in our city's downtowns in particular, what we see in downtown LA and what they were able to do there, I truly believe that in partnership, we can confront this housing crisis and do it in a way that protects what makes California truly special. Thank you.
Thank you, Assemblyman Haney. I'd like to invite to the stage Kate Connor from the City of San Francisco to make the next presentation.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Kate Connor. I serve as the Deputy Director of Housing for the current Planning Division at the San Francisco Planning Department. One of my key responsibilities is implementing state housing legislation and understanding the specific implications each law has on housing development within the city. Today, I'll be walking you through several important state laws and programs that are really shaping the current housing development climate. We'll explore two newer ministerial housing programs, SB 423 and AB 2011. We'll also discuss two cornerstone policies, State Density Bonus Law and the Housing Accountability Act. And finally, we'll wrap with a look at the Housing Crisis Act. While some of these programs are decades old, others are quite new. Before diving into the individual programs, let's quickly define what ministerial means in this context. Ministerial projects are not subject to any review under the California Environmental Quality Act, or CEQA, and they don't require discretionary approvals such as a conditional use authorization. These programs also come with guaranteed review timelines, either between 90 or 180 days, dependent upon the size of the project. In short, less process, no discretion, and faster approvals. Without CEQA review, you may be wondering how is the environment protected with these programs? All of these programs include eligibility requirements that really address environmental concerns. For example, projects are usually not eligible and prohibited in certain protected habitats. That said, many of these restrictions don't apply in big cities like San Francisco. However, we do see sometimes hazardous waste sites. If jurisdictions can't exercise discretion, you may ask what standards do apply. Ministerial programs require projects to meet objective standards. These are rules that can be applied without any personal or subjective judgment. Think of clear, measurable requirements like a numerical rear yard depth. On the other hand, something like a guideline requiring a project to be compatible or consistent with neighborhood character is not objective. Although they are separate programs, both SB 423 and AB 2011 share many similarities. Both require compliance with objective standards. Both are tied to the eligibility criteria that we just looked at. And both include labor provisions and require notification to the California Native American tribes. And importantly, both prohibit the demolition of designated listed historic resources, whether local, state, or national. So let's take a closer look at SB 423. This law creates a ministerial approval pathway for jurisdictions that are not meeting their state mandated housing goals, known as RHNA, that's the Regional Housing Needs Assessment. SB 423 sets up two different programs, one for jurisdictions not meeting low-income housing targets, and one for jurisdictions falling short of above moderate income housing. In San Francisco, we had been meeting our above moderate income goals until recently. And now that we've fallen behind, we are subject to the 10% program. Under SB 423, a qualifying project must produce at least 2 housing units. It cannot demolish any existing housing if that housing has been subject to rent control or any sort of affordability covenant. Like other ministerial programs, there are on-site affordability requirements as well as pre-submittal requirements. An important distinction for SB 423 is that the notification to the California Native American tribes is mandatory for all projects, which isn't the case for some of the other ministerial programs. And finally, in certain geographic areas, an informational hearing is required before a development application can be submitted. So the affordability requirements under SB 423 are a little complex. For projects with 11 units or more, 10% of the units must be affordable. But we also have to layer in San Francisco's already complex inclusionary housing requirements and see how they kind of merge together. We consider the inclusionary requirements also be objective standards so that we can still enforce those. When we merge the requirements, the typical project ends up needing about 15% of the units as affordable. An important note, though, is that for projects with fewer than 10 units, there are no affordability requirements, either state or local, which means that a 9-unit code-complying project could be eligible for ministerial review. So this is the hearing map. It kind of shows where that informational hearing is required. If you look at kind of the lighter areas on the map, that kind of shows where these areas happen to be. Basically, these areas are designated as a moderate resource area, low resource area, or an area of high segregation and poverty on the California Tax Credit Allocation Committee or Housing and Community Development Opportunity Map, quite a mouthful. And the informational hearing must happen before the development application is submitted. So now let's turn to AB 2011, a very similar but definitely a separate program. AB 2011 provides ministerial approval pathway for housing on commercially zoned sites. The law applies statewide to a property where office, retail, or parking is principally permitted. Projects under AB 2011 must meet specific criteria, including affordability requirements and minimum labor standards. Similar to SB 423, AB 2011 prohibits the demolition of designated historic resources. With regard to the pre-submittal requirements, that notification to the California Native American tribes is only required if the existing site is vacant, and there are no informational hearings required. This program is also split into two with slightly different requirements for each. One is reserved for the 100% affordable projects, and then the other is for mixed income housing projects. The mixed income program is stricter. It has more requirements, including on-site affordability. And again, we have to merge San Francisco's program with what the state is requiring. For this program, 5 units must be constructed versus the 2 in SB 423. This property must also be located on a wide commercial corridor. So think of like the El Camino Real. If there are existing commercial tenant, there are relocation requirements. And there are restrictions on the demolition of existing housing that was either subject to rent control or any sort of affordability covenant. The 100% affordable program is much more permissive. The project does not need to be located on a commercial corridor, so it makes it much more widely applicable within San Francisco. There is also no restriction on the demolition of housing, provided that replacement and relocation provisions are followed. So when we compare SB 423 and AB 2011, we do see a lot of overlap, but there's also some key differences. Both require ministerial review and compliance with objective standards and a prohibition on demolishing historic resources. Both require on-site affordability as well as labor standards. But while SB 423 is really tied to a jurisdictional housing production shortfalls, AB 2011 is tied to zoning, specifically commercial zoning. So now let's talk about a program that you might be more familiar with and you've seen more often, and that's the state density bonus law. This law allows projects to increase density, height, or floor area, and reduce development standards in exchange for providing on-site affordability. It's been around since 1979, but over the years, the legislature has expanded its provisions to make it more widely used. To qualify for state density bonus, a project must include on-site affordable units with the required percentage depending upon the income level that is served. Projects receive unlimited waivers from development standards to accommodate that extra density and any sort of requested incentive. The higher the share of affordability, or the deeper the affordability, the greater the bonus and the number of incentives that a project can receive. So what makes it such an important tool? Aside from the density bonus itself, The incentives and the waivers are essentially exceptions from code requirements. Ministerial programs recognize state density bonus projects as code complying, even with these exceptions. And a local jurisdiction has incredibly limited discretion to deny any of these waivers or incentives. There would have to be a specific adverse impact on public health and safety, and that's an incredibly high bar. Another key law is the Housing Accountability Act, which was passed in 1982. This law limits a jurisdiction's ability to deny or reduce the density of a code-compliant housing project. To be eligible, a project must contain 2 units, and in most cases be 2/3 residential. These projects are also limited to 5 hearings before a commission or hearing body. In other words, if a project meets all the applicable objective standards, the city must approve it, unless there's a specific adverse impact on public health and safety that can't be mitigated. So the intersection between these 2 laws and the ministerial programs is that state density bonus projects are considered to be code compliant, even with the requested waivers and incentives. And these projects can then qualify for ministerial programs and protection under the Housing Accountability Act. In addition, it's important to note too that the Housing Accountability Act has been strengthened over the years. And now jurisdictions may face fines of up to $10,000 per unit for wrongly denying or reducing the density of a code compliant project. Finally, let's touch upon the Housing Crisis Act. This law included a range of provisions that were really aimed at preventing local governments from downzoning, reducing housing capacity, or adding new discretionary rules or reviews that could delay housing. It focused on really 3 main areas: imposition of new development requirements, changes to the project review process, and then also replacement and relocation provisions for existing units. I think the project review process is probably the most pertinent for this group with regard to preservation. And basically what it said is that determinations that a site of a proposed housing development is historic must be made at the time that that development application is considered to be complete. That determination will also remain valid for the entire duration of that project review process. This prevents any sort of midstream landmarking or designation of resources. So how are resources protected? If there is a resource that is listed on the California Register, there is some protection under state density bonus law, which will require findings if there's any adverse impact on that resource. In addition, the ministerial programs prohibit demolition of these resources. For locally listed resources, the ministerial programs again prohibit that demolition, but there aren't the same protections under state density bonus law as there are for California listed resources. And then finally, unlisted historic buildings, ones that have just been locally surveyed and not formally listed, there isn't that protection under state law. And so this lack of protection is really motivating local jurisdictions to formally list all historic resources. Interested in learning more? I'm sure you are. We publish all of our guidance on all the state programs in a whole range of planning director bulletins for each new program that comes online. I definitely encourage everybody to take a look. They're great reads. They're perfect if you have insomnia, really very action-oriented. But really to summarize, I think we've covered maybe 5 state housing programs that really shape development in San Francisco and throughout the state. SB 423 and AB 2011 provide that ministerial approval pathway under specific conditions. State density bonus law allows for that additional density and incentives with affordable housing. And then the Housing Accountability Act and the Housing Crisis Act really limit a city's ability to deny a project or downzone compliant housing projects. So I think together, these laws have really created an environment where ministerial approvals are becoming more common, especially in San Francisco, and discretionary review is becoming the exception and not the rule. So looking ahead, we expect that these state housing laws to continue to evolve. New legislation is introduced every year. At the local level, I think that we're really working to update our objective standards to really better align with all the state requirements while really trying to maintain those values that keep San Francisco unique. I think it's a challenging balance, but an essential one as we really work to address the housing crisis. Thank you.
Thank you, Kate. Our next speaker is Lisa Kraus, who is the Senior Specialist Housing Policy. He's a Senior Specialist in the Housing Policy and Development Division of the California Housing and Community Development. She'll be speaking to the state oversight of local housing compliance.
Hi, folks. Is this a touch screen? No. Can everyone hear me? Okay. See if I get this touch just right. Okay, great. All right, well, as Cindy mentioned, my name is Lisa Kraus. I work for the Department of Housing and Community Development. It is a mouthful. I'm a senior housing policy specialist, and I'm in the Housing Policy Development Division in the Housing Accountability Unit. I am on a team, one team of 5 teams in that unit, and I specialize in the Surplus Land Act. That's the law that I'm one of specialists that enforce that law. There we go. So today I was tasked with presenting what we do at HCD in the Housing Accountability Unit. So I wanted to go over basically who we are, what we do, how we operate, some of the outcomes we've seen, and provide some tools and resources towards the end if there's time. How do I get rid of this bar? Okay, I'll leave it. It's not a touch screen. Thank you. There we go. All right, so here's our mission statement. Okay. HCD's mission is to promote safe, affordable homes and vibrant, inclusive, sustainable communities for all Californians. We're actually quite an expansive department, and we cover grants and funding, manufactured and mobile homes and their safety, building standards, also planning and community development, and policy and research. So who here likes history? Okay, great. I threw in this timeline just for you all. So HCD wasn't created until 1969, but some of the initial housing laws to really enforce housing standards came from 1909, which was the State Tenement House Act. And after that, from the 1920s and 30s, we found housing laws really to protect like industrial, agricultural workers and sanitation. So by 1965, HCD was created. General plans were also a requirement that same year. 1969, housing elements became a requirement. By the 1970s, 75, the Division of Research and Policy Development was created. And what's interesting, and I think Kate alluded to this as well, was 1970s and 80s, it's really the beginning of the housing crisis. I'll just pause right there. 1980s, we'll just pause. In the 1980s, anyone seen the movie Goonies? Okay, only like 5 people. Okay, thank you. So 1985, it came out. It's about 40 years ago. When I was watching it the other week, and I noticed some interesting connection there. You've got in 1985, a teenage boy, basically, his family's faced with foreclosure. And all of the Goondocks is basically slated to be demolished, 50 homes, right? And what happens basically is he's on a mission to save his home and all the homes of his friends and neighbors. And he does this only by chance of finding this map, a treasure map, right? So I'll just stop there. Maybe I'll loop back to it. But what I wanted to say is it's like he's the hybrid, right? The pro-housing preservationist. What we heard earlier was, how many people here are housing advocates? Okay. Good handful. Okay. Preservation advocates. Okay. Hybrid of the two. Okay, just about everybody. So there's some relation. I'll stop there and head to, I'll stay in the 70s and 80s. That's when a lot of our housing laws really started to make wind. Surplus Land Act really started as a law that was geared towards the sale of public land from cities and counties for the purpose of park and open space purposes. But by the 70s and 80s, it was made more towards housing, affordable housing. But it wasn't until really the 2000s, 2017, where there was enforcement effort and a record number of housing bills were signed. So with the signing of AB 72, AB 215, and AB 434, HCD basically got enforcement authority, and by 2021, the Housing Accountability Unit was established. So today, we have approximately 47 staff members on 5 teams to oversee many of these laws, which Kate covered. And according to our governor, a lot of those aims include to increase enforcement and oversight at the local level to create more housing faster in California. Local governments are being held accountable to meet those housing targets. So like the RHNA, with the statewide goal of reaching 2.5 million new units by 2030. And also remove bureaucratic roadblocks. Can you all see that? Okay. So just providing a list. It's not a full list of all the laws that we enforce, starting with ADU law, SB 9, and going all the way down to the Surplus Land Act. These are categorized by getting housing easier and faster. So that would be like ADU law, by right supportive housing density bonus, 5 hearings rule, over to getting those housings in more places, followed by higher density. So obviously density bonus, Housing Crisis Act, and lower incomes. So in context, Housing Accountability Unit is under the Land Use and Local Government Relations. To the right is where the sticks are. That's where I am in enforcement. But also to the left, we're accompanied with some of the carrots. So some of the carrots are funding, technical assistance, and also housing element review. We have housing element review on both sides. So we enforce housing elements and their programs, but we also do the review and technical assistance. For a more granular look, the lower portion is basically the 5 teams enforcing state law. Sorry, I'm really breathing into this. Sorry. And so our purpose and strategy is basically to ensure all local jurisdictions meet their fair share of the state's housing needs and promote housing production at all income levels. This includes providing education and technical assistance and holding jurisdictions accountable. So looping back over to our friends there in Astoria and the Goondocks. If you don't have a map, you're not going to get there. And the housing element provides that map. You've got the housing needs. You've got your sites inventory, very critical part of the housing element. Identifying where to build what, as well as identifying constraints. Does your local agency take much longer than average to process a permit? Those are the sort of things that are addressed in the program requirements. So you might have heard this before. The housing element is no longer a paper exercise as it was for decades. It's a contract with the states of housing commitments for 8 years, and the Housing Accountability Unit holds jurisdictions to those commitments. Some of the consequences of housing element noncompliance are ineligibility in receiving state funds. You might have heard the builder's remedy, which basically means that you can't use inconsistency with zoning and general plan standards to deny an affordable housing project, and other legal ramifications. So the 10,000 to 100,000 per month in fines. The technical assistance, though, to enforcement kind of looks like this. Like, let's say a developer is having an issue, or an advocate sees something that might be a violation, or a local jurisdiction just has a question about how a law gets applied. We hear about it through our portals. So the HAU has one, ADU, and the SLA, the Surplus Land Team, also has a portal where they submit requests or inquiries. And as an agency, we are tasked with investigating or providing assistance where it is needed. Where there's like a potential violation, we follow up with the developer or the stakeholder or the agency. Well, we do both. And we carefully look through the law and come to a determination. It might just be a technical assistance letter or a letter of support for a project. It could be many things. If there is a violation, we would write a notice of violation and potentially refer it to the Department of Justice. But that rarely happens. In total, we have over 800 technical assistance letters, but only 17 notices of violation, including we have 27 violations for housing elements. There are about 5 lawsuits, which, considering since 2021, it's actually quite small. And considering all the technical assistance, that usually does the trick. So outcomes, what are we seeing? With our efforts, with technical assistance, letters of support, we're seeing, at least for unlocked housing units in the accountability unit, over 8,000. For the Surplus Land Team, we've seen unlocked over 32,000. So I guess this is the question we're all wondering here at this conference is how do we meld these goals? Sorry about the end, it got lost. At least with the Surplus Lands Team, and I can speak to that mainly, a lot of jurisdictions can really leverage some of their public lands that they no longer need and turn them into housing, thereby meeting some of their RHNA goals. We see properties, not often with historic buildings on them, but it does happen occasionally. We see certainly malls, lots of underutilized asphalt parking lots, all potential for affordable housing. Just want to call out a couple. The city of Pasadena, for example, they found with their notice of availability for a few sites, they were able to put out a proposal and get 112 units right next to an affordable site. I'm sorry, historic site. And in Long Beach, we found that one historic armory is an adaptive reuse project now for 63 affordable units. Here are some tools and resources. They're available on, I guess, with CPF. So if you'd like to look through those. And here's some links. And if you have questions, there's my email. Thanks.
Thank you, thank you, Lisa. We are going to open up the floor now for any questions that you may have. If you have a question, you can come up to the microphone and ask our panel.
Okay, maybe I should.
Here, let me get the.
Is that? John, we have to stand right next to.
I'm just going to project. I have a comment and then a question. My comment is, and I for everyone in this room about this issue, that we phrase housing affordability crisis, not housing. We have an affordability crisis in this state, not a housing. So that's my soapbox. And then my question first for Kate is, you mentioned for SB 2011 that the corridor, that the commercial corridor has to be wide. How wide? 70 feet. 70 feet, okay. And then my question related housing crisis act has to be 30% for both of you. We are seeing a couple projects in San Francisco that are using SB 30. They are demolition of an existing single-family residence, construction of a large new single-family residence with a very tiny ADU. And they are using the Housing Crisis Act to do this. So I'm talking about a 14,500 square foot single-family house with a 650-foot ADU. How is that solving our housing affordability crisis? And as an enforcement officer, what can you do to say to the city, this project, it doesn't solve our affordability crisis? Might have to come up here. Our microphones went dead.
Thanks for the question. So I think kind of the law that you were speaking about is the Housing Accountability Act. And so that's if you have 2 units that are completely code compliant, then the city has very limited discretion to be able to deny that project or be able to reduce the density. And so that is something that, we have been struggling with as far as getting really small units. I mean, I think there's a few different ways that you can really address that, either with like minimum unit sizes, unit parity. There are objective requirements that could be legislated that could maybe bring greater parity to those types of units. But it's really on every single jurisdiction to create those objective standards to make sure that you're actually able to kind of enforce the housing that you would previously, in a discretionary manner, be able to approve.
I think Kate answered that. Well, I don't enforce that section of housing law. However, I can speak to when there is like a potential violation, or a resident or any other stakeholder thinks, okay, this looks like a violation of housing law. That's you want us to look into it. Generally, so one of the teams is a bit understaffed though, and so sometimes it's got to meet some certain parameter. Yeah, we do provide the technical assistance. Either it could just be an informal email letting, section of the law where you would find that sort of thing. So I would direct you to that. That was one of the last slides. I didn't get to spend much time on it. So thanks.
If people could repeat the questions.
Yeah.
I've not heard 8557 and some information on what is the what its status is.
Oh, yes. Yes, so this is a bill that we had last year that made it to the governor's desk. Opportunity for locals to be able to get some property tax reinvestment into these adaptive reuse projects, sets some requirements in terms of approval, so it streamlines approvals for the adaptive reuse for these projects, and then in language that we worked out with you all, really sets some frameworks around the historic preservation standards for how this is done. So especially for buildings that are not yet on the registry, that we have a way to make sure we're using the building standards that protect what needs to be protected there. And so we really wanted to make sure that we looked at opportunities from buildings that weren't necessarily on the registry, but also we extended those standards to protect the historic aspects of it to these projects. And so we work closely on the historic preservation aspect of that bill with you all. And so the bill was vetoed, unfortunately, last year. And it was vetoed because near the end of the process, there was some labor language that was inserted into it that was problematic for the governor. And we've taken that language out this time. And so it's a bill that we hope can get to the governor and be signed. So it'll open up some opportunities for both resources for these projects, quicker timelines and approvals, but also a real emphasis on protecting buildings, including ones that aren't necessarily yet on the registry.
So is that been adopted or is it going to be?
Oh, good question. Sorry. It passed out of the Housing Committee, which I chair, so no surprise there maybe, but it's got unanimous support. It's in the Appropriations Committee. We expect that it'll go directly to the Assembly floor because it doesn't have any significant costs. And so far, last year and this year, it had overwhelming support. It only kind of started to get into some trouble when it got into the labor issues. So we hope that it gets done this year, and we're in close partnership with you all. It's basically the exact same language last year that you helped us you all helped us draft, that Cindy was very involved with. And it's the same language. The only difference is the labor piece. Yes, I'm sure there are ways to be involved, and we want for you all to help us talk to your respective legislators about the bill and its importance, and the fact that this is one of those win-wins where we can do adaptive reuse. Let's do it right. Let's make sure those standards are there that we all agree to, and so I think it's really a model for how we can do this. And it will lead to more housing getting built, and it will lead for us doing it the right way, kind of similar to some of what we saw in LA, in downtown LA. We took a lot of what they did, and there's opportunities there, but we don't want to see, buildings just because it's not on the registry getting torn down because they want to do something, or done in ways that really damage a lot of the pieces of it that should be protected. And so we were really clear about that, and essentially just extended these existing building standards to all of these other buildings in the case of the adaptive reuse. Is that accurate? Okay.
That is accurate. And what I would encourage you to do is to look at the bill, because it was a lot of, give and take, and trying to do this really in the spirit of streamlining and getting more adaptive reuse online. So, and what you can do, of course, naturally read the bill, but write letters of support and reach out to your legislators. Because this was something that was important. I think another important aspect of the bill is it protected adaptive reuse ordinances that were already in place. So it did not it didn't overrule those. Those are still there. But I think it is very important to show your support, because this is all in our wheelhouse. Looking at existing building stock, older historic building stock, and those that aren't listed. We wanted protections, and this is quite frankly what happens when you're at the table, is you have some influence. So write your legislator, read the bill, and show your support.
And I forgot one more thing I would add. One of the things that's special about it is even though we talk about it as office to residential, and that's kind of the emphasis, it allows for a significant part of the process to be for other uses. And so we understand that with some of these opportunities for adaptive reuse, some of it you want to protect other uses that are also very important, maybe the original use or other new uses. We have to be able to be flexible and creative when it comes to these projects, and not just say it has to be all housing, and that's going to shut down a lot of it. So it really, these are mixed use projects that there's a minimum percentage that has to be housing, but it allows for a lot of other types of uses too.
Are there any other questions? Okay, can you come up? I wish we had a microphone for you.
For a couple years, I've been interested in it. It's a Berkeley theater that's facing some development. This sounds like the perfect adaptive use for possibly saving this from demolition. Will it, if it passes, which we hope it will it be retroactive? Because this is a project that will take years.
Will it be retroactive? No, this will be for new.
From that moment onwards.
That moment, but if there was a new proposal to do a certain type of project with it, then that would be eligible. So I don't know what status that project is in right now. Or?
It's in the process of, with planning, they're looking at design at this point. They did try to save it, but it failed. Council did not vote to preserve it.
So they could potentially resubmit under this framework.
Oh.
And then it would have some new opportunities.
Okay.
With that.
Thank you.
We are going to have another Q&A.
Thanks. I think a lot of the tension a lot of us practitioners of historic preservation have with these streamlining laws is that the laws have designation as a requirement for protection. And so much of the work we do is on resources that haven't been evaluated or studied yet. And so now any effort to do that is seen as disingenuous and anti-housing, and that's not the intention either. So I guess what a little bit of that, and then also highlighting that for California Register and National Register designation, there is consent required, which is another roadblock for us to be able to acknowledge important resources. And I would take this opportunity. I know that AB 609 is working its way through, and that has the same language. And so I would just advocate for that language to be updated to say eligible resources instead of listed.
What's 609?
It is another streamlining effort that is for properties that have already been previously developed, and it's working its way through committee right now, I think.
Maybe, so is that on a little bit? Okay. I think it's a really good point, and it's actually something that I had the opportunity to learn a lot about through our process with this bill around adaptive for office to housing conversions. And we essentially just had to create our own way to look at it. So based on essentially when the building was built, we wanted to apply some level of standards around it for the purposes of adaptive reuse, with the recognition that a lot of the buildings that should be protected, or various aspects of it should be protected, are not yet designated. And so this was a way for us to historic resources and that go beyond the registry, because I think the registry, as I've come to understand, is hugely inadequate, and ultimately we need a much broader registry where each locality and other places are really taking stock of what their historic resources are. I think our state lacks that at scale, and that's something else that we've talked about. But short of that, I do think, and that's something that we should do in partnership, be able to have better ways to identify what needs protecting and how to do so beyond solely just relying on the registry. But I'm also open to guidance on that from you all, best to do it.
HCD implements the laws that we're given, so we we enforce them.
We're going to thank you for your time for speaking. We're going to invite our next group up.
Okay, while he gets the next presentation up, I'll just start. My name is Greta Seuss. I'm a senior planner with the City of Sacramento, and my work focuses mostly on housing policy and program implementation. So I'm going to moderate this next section of the panel, which I'm really excited about. Today, we're going to hear from 5 panelists split into 2 parts. So our first 2 speakers, we'll hear from our Charles Loveman of Heritage Housing Partners and Brandon Spencer Hartle from the City of Portland. Charles will set the stage first with a great overview of why increasing density in all of our city's neighborhoods is important and how exactly he accomplishes that at Heritage Housing Partners in an affordable manner, which is very cool and exciting in my opinion. And then Brandon will present on Portland's Missing Middle program, the Residential Infill Project, and lessons learned for California as jurisdictions start to embark on this journey ourselves in California. And then after our break, we'll hear from 3 other California jurisdictions on how they're increasing allowed densities in their city's neighborhoods and how they're interfacing with historic preservation. So Charles, I'll introduce you first and then you can present. So Charles Loveman is the Executive Director of Heritage Housing Partners, a nonprofit affordable housing developer based in Pasadena. And Heritage Housing Partners' mission is to create affordable housing and neighborhood revitalization by providing home ownership opportunities to low, moderate, and workforce income first-time homebuyers. To date, HHP has developed 251 units of affordable and market rate homeownership housing with a number 235 units in the pipeline. Over his career, Charles has been active in community housing and historic preservation organizations, and he is the former board president of the West Hollywood Community Housing Corporation. And he currently serves as a member of the City of Pasadena's Reconnecting Communities 710 Advisory Board. So I'll give it to you, Charles.
Thank you. Thank you, Greta. Yes, Heritage Housing Partners. I am going to give a presentation. The first few slides are charts. I know that we're planners and preservationists and we don't like charts, but we'll get through this together. The thing I pay a lot of attention to is what's happened in the rental market over the last 20 plus years. So I am going to show you what's happened in the rental market in California. Well, in this case, in LA County over the last 20 plus years. So this is a chart of renter household incomes in the year 2000, pardon me, but with adjusted for inflation. So these are in 2023 dollars. And you can see the green trend line there. It's sort of trying to be a bell-shaped curve. It starts with, the first category is 0 to 5,000. The last 2 categories, which you might not be able to read, are 100,000 to 150,000. That's renter household income. And then the last category, 150,000 or above. So year 2000, 23 years ago, adjusted for inflation, we're talking about in the last 2 categories, about 148,000 households in LA County who made over 150 grand a year. And now we add 2010 data, a decade later, adjusted for inflation. What impresses me about this is that when you adjust for inflation, pretty much the numbers are the same in each of those categories. You can see the percentages. We had 1.6 million renter households in LA County in 2000, and it went up to 1.7 million renter households 10 years later. And now we add 2020 to the mix, again, all in 2023 dollars. For most of the different categories, we've got these 3 bar charts. The percentages are the same, except when you get to the very high income, the $150,000 a year or more, it went from, I think that's 9% to 15%, so about a 67% increase, all in the same dollars. And then we add 2023. So now that last category, same thing, we went from 9% in the year 2000 to 15% in the year 2023. And then the next category to the left, 100 grand to 150 grand, is also starting to show some pretty big variations. And I'm sorry that you might not be able to read the numbers. I can't read them from here. But what does 15% mean? 15% is 286,000 households in LA County. This is not people, this is households. 286,000 households making over 150 grand a year. If you add the category to the left, that's 578,000 households making over $100,000 a year, and they're renters. In any other time before the Great Recession, before 2010, those folks, a lot of those folks would have moved into first-time ownership. But that doesn't happen anymore. That chart, if you also look at the trend line for 2000 and 2010, and now you look at the trend line for 2020 and 23, we have an upward sloping trend line. What's going on is we're stockpiling higher income renters in the rental market because we can't move them into the first-time ownership market. And that, what's happening at the high end of the rental market is having consequences for the folks at the low end of the rental market. And if you want to see a really whack out chart, this is the Bay Area. These are the 9 counties of the San Francisco Bay Area. 46% of all renter households in the Bay Area make over 100 grand a year. Candidates for first-time ownership, but there's no place to go because it costs too much to build, prices are too high. If you're making 150 grand a year, you should be able to afford a $600,000 or $700,000 purchase price for a home, except for programs like ours and Habitat. Those prices don't exist. And it's the same thing. You can see those last 2 categories, 577,000, just like the 578 for LA County. And that last category, the 30% making over 150 grand in the Bay Area, that's 375,000 households. In California, we probably have, we have 577 and 578 in LA County and San Francisco. We must have approaching 2 million households in the entire state making over 100 grand a year. If we could get them out of the rental market into first-time ownership, it would really have positive consequences for everyone else in the rental market. So what are the causes for this? Well, no one builds a starter home because it just costs too damn much. It costs us anywhere between 750 and 850 grand to build a 3-bedroom unit in Pasadena. We used to build a lot of ownership units. Prior to the Great Recession, we built 155,000 ownership units a year on average. Today, we build 65,000 ownership units a year, 90,000 unit deficit times 15 years, because that's how long we haven't done it. It's about 1.3 million units that we have not built, ownership units that we have not built. And by the way, every time you turn a renter into a first-time owner, you leave a vacant rental unit behind. So you're really creating 2 units when you build a brand new ownership unit for a first-time buyer. And because we don't build these, we're now 49th out of 50 states in terms of housing units per capita. So we have a shortage across the board. What are the consequences of stockpiling high-income renters in the rental market? Well, it drives up rents for everybody, but especially for those at the lower end of the market. It creates rental shortages, shortages of units, which we just talked about. And the impact of that is especially at the lower end of the market. And it does deprive those households who make really good money, who should be in line to be first move into ownership and start getting the benefits of wealth creation that ownership it creates. And if you want to see a little bit about wealth creation, there's a thing called the Case-Shiller Index that tracks home prices in 20 markets around the US. And they track San Francisco and LA. So this is LA data going back to 1980. And I'm just looking at a bunch of different 5-year periods and what the annualized appreciation is and what the total appreciation is. So if you are lucky enough to move from being a renter to an owner and you pay your mortgage on time, you will begin to enjoy these kinds of benefits in terms of price appreciation. How do we at Heritage Housing Partners address some of this disparity? How do we move people from low and middle and moderate and middle income renters into first-time owners? Well, the first thing we do is attack down payments. The idea of a 20% down payment is just foolishness. So we have a 3% down payment, of which only 1/3, 1% has to be the buyer's own funds. The biggest barrier for those high income renters to become first time owners is that 20% down payment piece. And it's not really necessary. They do it as a hedge against someone defaulting. But today, with credit scores, they know who's going to pay their bills and who's not. So you don't really need 20% down. We've been doing this since 1998, never had a default with any of our buyers. Lower interest rates. We always try to buy down the interest rate on the first mortgage, or we work with a lender who will buy down an interest rate on the first mortgage. By the way, I should say, Greta told me to include pictures of our past projects. So these are our past projects on the slide. So in this photo, this is a project we completed in 2023 in Pasadena. Everyone, all the low mod buyers, 35 buyers out of 48 units, got a 2.75% 30-year fixed rate mortgage when the rates were 6.75. A 1 point change in the mortgage gives you 10% more purchasing power or 10% less purchasing power, depending upon which way we're going. So taking the rate from 675 to 275 gave those folks 40% more purchasing power than they would have otherwise had for this same monthly payment. So buy down the rates. And then I won't go into the details, but no mortgage insurance. If somebody is quoting you mortgage insurance, call me. You don't need mortgage insurance if you deal structure it correctly. And the last thing is we embrace mixed income for a lot of reasons. But one of the reasons is we can self-subsidize middle income units by selling some units at market. And one of the reasons, but the other reason we like mixed income is because there's a ton of social science research that says that if you're a kid from a poor family living in a poor neighborhood, you're probably going to be poor all your life. And if you're a kid living of a poor family living in a mixed income neighborhood, you have a pathway out of poverty. There are a handful of state programs where they're encouraging deeply affordable rental projects to go into disadvantaged communities. I don't get that, because to me, that's basically a recipe for keeping people in poverty forever, versus we know from social science research that people who live in mixed income communities have a pathway out of poverty. So that's why we like mixed income. I have a short list of policy choices that the state could embrace to make it easier to incentivize first-time ownership. The one I want to focus on is the first one. You can read the rest. But the first one is something called a single-family mortgage revenue bond. A lot of words. What that does is give a home buyer a mortgage interest rate, which is a tax-exempt interest rate. We have not done this in California since, I think, 1996. It's almost 25. I can't do the math. It's been a long time since California has embraced this. Pretty much every tax-exempt bond with it that is related to housing in California is for LIHTC. It's for low-income housing tax credits. I don't get it, why we're not helping. So today, that interest rate for a mortgage, if we issued these mortgage revenue bonds, would be 4.5% that a buyer would get. So we should be doing this to help folks move out of the rental market. And we can help folks move out of the rental market because we do it every day. We know how to do it there, but there are a lot of tools that the state has that we're just not using in order to do it at a higher scale than what's happening. But we can make this happen. We just have to want to. Thanks.
Okay, thank you so much, Charles. Our second speaker, Brandon Spencer Hartle, is a Historic Resources Program Manager at the City of Portland, Oregon. For the last 10 years, Brandon has managed Portland's regulatory framework for historic buildings, including code amendment projects, design standards and design guideline updates, and incentives for adaptive reuse. Brandon is originally from Sacramento and, fun fact, has lived in multi-unit rental housing since he graduated high school. We need to get your presentation up, so I'm going to look for it here. Okay, welcome, Brandon.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. I was here last year and had the pleasure of being back again this year. I do have two opening questions because I don't know who you all are and you're going to look at me for the next 10 minutes. So since I was here last year, who's been to Portland, Oregon in the last 1 year? Now, everyone else raise your hands, the whole room. I look forward to seeing you in the next year before I come back to CPF in 2026. So I have one more question. Who here has lived in an accessory dwelling unit? A couple people, leave your hands up. Who here has lived in a duplex ever in your life? A triplex, keep the hands up. A quadplex, a townhouse, a walk-up apartment? I think that's almost everyone in the room, maybe not quite everyone. So what I want to talk about today is I want to talk about middle housing. And middle housing means different things to different people. I don't think as a field, as planners, preservationists, designers, we've quite landed on what missing middle or middle housing looks like. For some people, middle housing can be anywhere up to 20 units or 25 units. Other people are thinking just about maybe backyard ADUs and duplexes. For me, I think of middle housing as a walk-up or a side-by-side apartment. So this could be an ADU or a duplex, triplex, probably does not have an elevator, probably wood frame construction, maybe 2, possibly 3 stories. So we're talking about sort of that residential scale development. Here's a great fourplex in Portland, Oregon, individual landmark property built in 1889. So we've been building middle housing in America, obviously around the whole world for many, many years. So just as a quick background, here's a little bit of information on Portland's land use context. So for those of you who have been to Portland, you may know it. Portland is a little bit larger than Sacramento. The Portland metro area is a little larger than the Sacramento metro area. So think of it as sort of a comparable to where we are today. In terms of urban zoning, just under half of the city is zoned for single dwelling use. About 8% is zoned for multi-dwelling use, so apartment type development, 7% for mixed use, and about 42% for industrial parks and other sort of non-urban development or non-residential development scenarios. So when you take out that industrial and parks land, about 75% of the city of Portland's developable land is in what we call as single dwelling zones. That's the yellow on the map. Just for context, in the city of Portland, 3.9% of our developable land is designated either an individual landmark or as part of a district. And of those yellow single dwelling zones, 5.7% of those are included in some historic designation. Context for Oregon, we require owner consent for historic designation, and we do rely in part on the National Register of Historic Places to automatically apply land use protection. So a little different than you are here. We don't have a CEQA, so our world looks a little more like we designate things, we protect things, and if it's not designated at the time of a development application, we're sort of SOL on whether we're preserving that place. So today I want to talk about our single dwelling zones. It's about half of the city that is historically, since the 1920s, been reserved for primarily a house, and that's it. So back in the late 2010s, 2016, 2017, 2018, when I got my start at the Planning Bureau, what we were seeing in the city of Portland was a high number of one-for-one demolitions. So we were talking about somewhere between 100 and 350 houses every year being demolished and replaced by another single family house. And so we were losing older and existing building stock. To Charles' points earlier, we were losing a lot of first-time home buyer opportunities. We were losing all the embodied carbon in those existing buildings. And what we were replacing them with were larger single family houses, many of which were more auto-oriented and at a price point that generally wasn't for the first-time home buyer. Like I said, we were seeing larger houses. We were seeing buildings. I'm gonna do a little tech review here. Thank you. We were seeing declining ownership affordability. So citywide, what we were seeing is communities of color were less and less able to buy a first-time home. And then by the late 2010s, less and less middle-income Portlanders of all backgrounds able to buy a first-time home. few neighborhood rental options, so living near the school your kids may go to or living close to a grocery store, and seeing a significant demand for multi-generational housing, alternatives to stay in your neighborhood and downsize, and adapting larger, older houses to new uses. So we're hearing this from the community. We are hearing a lot of concern both from housing advocates and preservationists about the rate of change. And so Portland rethought the single dwelling zone in 2021. So in 2021, after about 4 years of extensive public involvement with every neighborhood in the city with a variety of interest groups, our city council adopted new policies governing development in the single dwelling zones. Those policies were developed being informed by housing advocates, primarily a group called Portland Neighbors Welcome, which is our local YIMBY group, historic preservation advocates who had long wanted to see adaptive reuse of larger, older structures, and thousands of people throughout the community. We did two things that I think are useful for people in this room to know about. One, we commissioned a local architecture firm, Decca Architecture, to look at the feasibility of converting bigger, older houses and what policies would make that more likely. And two, we looked at a displacement risk analysis for the entire city to better understand whether allowing these new middle housing dwelling units would result in the loss of renter owners who have been there for a long time and in some cases many generations. So our big code changes in 2021 included limiting the size of new houses and limiting those new houses to something smaller than would be allowed for a duplex, triplex, or quadplex, trying to move the market towards building middle housing, allowing additional housing types. I won't describe all of them. I know they're small on the screen today, but we now allow duplexes, triplexes, quadplexes, cottage clusters, second ADUs, and in the case of affordable housing, sixplexes in all of our residential zones, so that about half of the city where we didn't allow those before, generally speaking, we now allow those in the single dwelling zones. We do allow bonuses for affordability, so regulated affordable units, which I'll talk about more in a minute, can be a larger building and can have up to 6 units. We eliminated parking requirements citywide, and we have some requirements for accessible units in those larger for middle housing, the fourplexes and the sixplexes. And one thing we've done, and we can talk about it more in the Q&A, is we've allowed land divisions. And so what we're seeing is fee simple ownership, townhouse style of some of these duplexes, fourplexes, and sixplexes. On the preservation side, at the same moment as we adopted the new allowed uses in the residential zones, our city council also adopted a suite of protections and regulations pertaining to existing buildings. One thing that our council did in 2022 was to adopt demolition review, which is a local review that can result in denial for all properties listed in the National Register of Historic Places and any property that's been locally designated in a local district local district. And so that's about 5.7% of the residential land has that demolition review. In historic building sites, so designated historic buildings, we do not cap the number of residential units that are allowed. So you have a large old house in a residential zone, and you have a program to allow to design micro housing in that building. We don't cap the number of dwelling units on the site. So it can be both the existing building and adjacent. We've applied objective design standards for accessory dwelling units and some of our middle housing units in historic areas. We have a property tax and system development charge incentive to build affordable housing. And then a couple of things that I think could be helpful for this room. One, we also require manual deconstruction or hand deconstruction of any existing residential building built before 1940, whether it's designated historic or not. And so part of the program, the larger thing is we want more housing, we want a more diverse set of housing options, but we want to do right by our existing building stock, apply a strong regulatory constraint to demolition of designated buildings, and to expect that existing older buildings that may not be designated or eligible are hand deconstructed so that material stays out of the landfill, that we reduce the amount of toxic materials that go into the atmosphere and on the property, and that gives us a used material bank to reincorporate into existing buildings or other uses. So since 2021, here's a few examples of middle housing. On the left, there are townhouse style sixplexes and a fourplex unit, accessory dwelling units in historic districts in the middle, and 2 internal conversion projects on the right, a large landmark house that's being currently converted into, I think, 4 dwelling units, and then an individual smaller landmark house that now has a basement accessory dwelling unit. Since 2021, we've permitted 1,400 ADUs and middle housing units. The most common type of middle housing we're seeing are ADUs and fourplexes. One thing that's been interesting is that our demolition applications in the residential zones haven't gone down, but what we're seeing is we're seeing a significant increase in the amount of density that replaces those middle housing units. Most of those demolitions that we're seeing are smaller houses that are likely not eligible for landmark designation, and many that were built after 1940, not subject to the deconstruction ordinance. Our designated historic districts are producing middle housing, but at a rate less than the rest of the city. So something we're hearing about from our housing advocates is, hey, can historic districts punch at or above their weight? What does that look like? What do we do? So we have more work to do on our part. A couple last things I'll say, half of our middle housing units are on their own lot, so they're fee simple ownership. So to Charles's points earlier, we're seeing many of those, not so much the internal conversions of houses, but flag lots and land divisions that allow for owner occupancy. Most have no parking. The typical middle housing units are just a little bit less than 1,000 square feet. And the most interesting, I think, statistic from our data review that just finished up in February is that middle housing is selling for $300,000 less than single family houses. So what we're seeing is we're seeing a price point that's available to first-time buyers in close-in neighborhoods and historic areas. So I think Cindy asked me to give some recommendations, and we're going to be happy to answer questions, but the 5 things I would recommend to California, having grown up here, having lived in middle housing for a long time: allow middle housing in your historic areas. Allow it in historic districts, allow it in landmark buildings. Don't fight the use. It's a good thing for historic districts. It's a good thing to make the case. Like Assemblymember Haney was saying, you want people occupying buildings, using buildings, loving buildings, and you want them in historic areas. Codify objective standards, reasonable objective standards when appropriate. So think about how you can make it easier to add accessory dwelling units, how you can make it easier to add a basement unit, how you can allow new middle housing in maybe your historic areas that aren't maybe your most significant historic districts. So allow those objective standards in lieu of discretionary reviews when appropriate. Let go of unit caps. So many communities are thinking, oh, we can't have more than 2 units. Think about how we might encourage the reuse of buildings by going beyond a duplex or a triplex use. Allow as much use opportunity in those existing buildings as possible. Get rid of the notion of these prescriptive typologies. Many communities require front door entrances on 2 streets if it's on a corner, or some specific porch requirements. Sometimes they work, sometimes they don't. And then the last thing is, if you haven't already in historic areas, get rid of your parking requirements. What we're seeing with the 75% of middle housing that's being developed without parking is that they're much more context responsive without the parking than they would be with it. To the extent that local governments can allow flexibility for adding housing units and maybe additional opportunities for reducing setbacks or allowing flexibility with site development for designated historic resources, give it. You want people like Charles and his team and others in the room to have the flexibility they need to reuse those buildings, to have the flexibility they need to get the right owner-renter mix on a property. So to the extent that you can allow to help the market want to invest in historic buildings, do it. And the last thing I'll say, and to my knowledge, I don't think any California community has done this, but correct me if I'm wrong with booze or tomatoes. I don't think any California community has a comprehensive deconstruction ordinance. Many other communities around the country are getting there. It has been one of the best ways for us to build a partnership between the builders and communities in older areas and areas of existing buildings where designation will never be appropriate because they're not eligible or because there's been an integrity loss. And so think about what you're doing with your materials before they go to the landfill, and take a look at Austin, San Antonio, Portland, some of these communities that have gone this direction. So I'm happy to answer questions. I'll turn it back over to Greta. Thank you all for listening, and come visit in Portland this year, and I'll see you next year.
Testing. There we go. Awesome. I'm going to ask a couple of questions and then open it up to the group folks can go up to the microphone. So for both you, Brandon, and Charles, what incentives or policy choices can localities implement to create more first-time home buyer opportunities?
Mortgage revenue bonds. Mortgage revenue bonds. So there's this thing called the volume cap for tax exempt bonds. I don't know if you guys know in the weeds of that stuff, but California is allowed to issue about $43 billion of tax exempt bonds for a variety of purposes, including rental housing. The fact that we have not been able for almost 20 years to do any sort of bond issue to support affordable ownership, it's just shocking to me, especially when you guys saw the charts, what's going on in the rental market. So one thing the state can do is just make it a little cheaper to be a homeowner. Sorry. I have no complaints with the local jurisdictions where we work because they give us a lot of financial support. So Pasadena and is our home, and almost all our projects are there, and they're great.
I don't think Portland has done our program perfectly, but we were first out of the gate. And so we are learning now from what other cities are doing. And a couple of things that I think we have done, but maybe can do better in the future, are allowing those land divisions. So thinking about like maybe a typical residential infill site and allowing small partitioning of that land for fee simple ownership for traditional mortgages for people who might be buying a first-time home buyer opportunity, and specific to historic resources, allowing flag lots and allowing creative divisions of that land so that the existing building doesn't require demolition to make way for the new middle housing unit. So it's in the weeds a little bit, but if we want to get owner occupancy opportunities and we want to save the existing building on an existing lot, you will want to talk to your local government about whether there's a creative way to allow those land divisions. The second thing I'll say is a not insignificant number of our middle housing units are being sold at affordable price points, more for sale than rental, but we do see some rental. And there's two things that we've done that has really unlocked that affordability. One, we provide a 10-year property tax exemption, which is a $30,000 to $50,000 benefit for properties that are sold at a regulated affordable level of the 80 to 120% median area income. And the second thing we've done is we've waived system development charges, which are a way that we pay for utility services for affordable units. Fun fact, as a city, we're experiencing some of the slowdown that San Francisco and others are. And our mayor just announced last week for the next 5,000 units that come in for permitting, we are suspending those system charges to try to get more activity for office to residential conversions and more urban development. And so we're trying to use these tools we can to remove barriers, especially for affordable units, but also for historic preservation.
Thank you. And then Charles, your organization does really a unique type of development. Why do you think more developers aren't doing this type of work in California, creating more first-time home buyer opportunities?
Well, first of all, we're called Heritage Housing Partners because we started off as a spin-off of Pasadena Heritage to do affordable housing and historic buildings was sort of the specific purpose of our organization. And we kind of outgrew it over the years. So probably 2/3 of what we do is new units and 1/3 is historic, affordable housing and historic buildings. But I think most nonprofits sort of follow the money and all the money's in rental. So that's why it's a lonely place. But yeah, truly, truly gratifying to do it. And people ask us to go into other parts of California to develop. We're really reluctant to do that because I think one of the things that makes us successful is we know our community really well. But I am trying to encourage other organizations and other historic preservation advocacy organizations to do what we did 20 years ago and create their own version of Heritage Housing Partners or Sacramento.
Awesome. I want to make sure we have time for folks in the audience to ask questions. So if you have one, please come up.
Okay. I have a question first for Charles. Why has California not passed any revenue mortgage bonds? And then I have another question follow-up for Brandon.
I think this is a completely strange answer, but when you're a legislator and you come home and you have a town hall meeting and all the folks talk about is the homelessness on the streets of your district, that you focus all your attention on that. And you don't see the correlation between what's happening at the higher end of the rental market impacting the lower end of the rental market. And so we're just swamped with that issue. And so, yeah, it's time to make that linkage and then help those folks get into ownership, but that's my answer is.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really good observation, and I think it's something that all of us here in the room should start thinking about and educating decision makers to use that as a tool, because you're right, it's time. And then Brandon, I have a question for you. With the missing middle housing that is being produced out of existing housing, when you are breaking a larger home into smaller units, do each of those units have their own kitchen and bathrooms, or are there any shared facilities?
Yeah, that's a great question. We allow both. So you can take a big old house that's a landmark and convert it into what we call transient lodging or SRO housing. You can convert that big old house into rental housing with its own, each unit having its own utilities, or you could produce owner occupancy. We have seen a small handful of owner occupancy conversions, statistically not meaningful, but some great preservation projects, fantastic buildings, slightly larger handful of rental housing options in those larger older houses. And we haven't yet seen in the last 4 years, to my knowledge, any SRO type housing or transient lodging type housing. There's a couple of things that are going on with the conversions. I'm really excited about them. I'm an evangelist, but they're not necessarily our only solution to production. They will be meaningful, but the new development is where we're really seeing the units. And part of that is because of that fee simple ownership. People who want a first time house, they want a house, not necessarily a condo. And when they're looking to buy, it's easier if you have your own lot. And those conversion projects are always complicated. What we know from our middle housing development is price per square foot for those new units is pretty high. When compared to a new single dwelling house, and it's because of the kitchens and the bathrooms. You know, you have something that looks like, oh, it looks like kind of a big house. It's actually a fourplex. There's 4 kitchens, 8 bathrooms, as opposed to a single family house. I want to say one thing, I know we're going to run out of time, and I think one of the challenges that we face that I think it's valuable to say here is we, much like Sacramento and the Bay Area and California generally, we have a very loud and motivated group of housing advocates that fall under the YIMBY sort of campaign. And one of the things that's been a struggle, both as city staff, but also working with the preservation advocates, is how effective those groups have become and how often preservation gets marginalized in the sidelines. And so to the extent that people in the room can do the hard work of building relationships with your housing advocates in the community to find those areas of compromise. I know CPF has done that on a few pieces of state legislation. They are energized, and I think as someone who doesn't own a house, they have a very compelling message about getting first-time homeownership opportunities that Charles talked about. And if preservationists aren't there with them at the table to demonstrate what that can look like, to show a willingness to roll up sleeves together, what I'm seeing in other communities, I'm even seeing it in our state legislature and communities around Oregon, oftentimes preservation will be forgotten because of the crisis we're in of affordability. And so to the extent that people in the room can dedicate the time and the emotional energy of going and getting to know your local YIMBY groups and finding those areas of alignment, that is going to save you from watching landmark buildings demolished in your future.
Hello. I was wondering if either of you mentioned flag lots as one option for creative subdivision. That's something in Long Beach we struggle with, is like neighbors having fights and challenges over flag lots and ownership. So has that been successful? Like, have you seen it done in Portland or elsewhere in Pasadena? And just wanted to hear about that.
I'll answer it first and give it over to Charles. Yeah, there are challenges with flag lots, and there's not just neighbor challenges, but there are challenges with fire access, there's challenges with egress, there's challenges with utilities. And so they're not a perfect solution all of the time, but we have seen a significant handful of existing buildings in historic districts and historic areas preserved because flag lots are an option. So retaining the existing building, allowing development in the rear of the lot that's sold fee simple, has saved us buildings that otherwise would have come in for demolition application. And I think given the politics of the room, some of those are great buildings, probably would have been approved by our city council for a demolition review because of the added housing. The flag lot was the opportunity to save those. And one in particular, historically Black neighborhood, significant 1890s Victorian house, flag lot is going to be the only way to save that building and get us to housing units. And for those who aren't familiar with a flag lot, imagine a flag with a pole and a flag at the top. It's sort of dividing a lot in a way that looks like that.
we're typically building condos at 20 to 30 units per acre, or something like that. So it's not, doesn't come up a lot for us. Just as a sidebar, I have no idea if Heritage Housing Partners will be involved in Altadina's rebuild or not. I don't know. I don't think anybody really knows where that's headed. But those kinds of solutions for Altadena, which is a much lower density area that wants to stay low density, I think would be on the list.
We have a few minutes left, so maybe 1 or 2 questions.
Thank you for the discussion. My question's for Brendan. It has to do with the point that you raised during your presentation about middle housing in historic districts. Can you elaborate on what that is and why you think it's occurring? And then one additional question for all of you, which has to do with land trusts. Community land trusts as a way to bring down the cost of developing affordable housing.
Yeah. I'll take it first and I'll hand it off to Charles for the land trust question because I'm not expert in that area. We have 3 different types of historic districts in Portland. We've got National Register districts, local conservation districts, and local historic districts. And those 3 flavors generally correspond to the level of design regulation we apply. No design regulation in National Register districts, objective design standards in conservation districts, and oftentimes discretionary review, but not always in historic districts. All of them have demo review in the same way. And so what we've seen, a couple things that are interesting in our historic districts, we are seeing ADUs, and not insignificant number of ADUs. We're seeing some duplexes, but we're generally seeing that the historic districts fall in parts of the city where land values are too high to justify development and either demolition and the subsequent development or development on vacant land. And so one of the interesting things we have to grapple with as a city is not all, but many of our historic districts are in the nicer parts of the city that don't have the economics that allow for first-time middle housing development to occur. We are seeing, how do I want to say this? We're seeing fewer fights than we saw in the past around the design of middle housing because we've got this objective design track in some cases. And I think what we've seen is we've seen a recognition in many of those historic areas that there's been hiding middle housing the whole time. There's been duplexes and houses that were converted into other units. And generally we brought those neighborhoods along, but some of our builders are still dubious to go into historic districts, fearing the kind of fights that can come up. And so we've got work to do at the city to build trust that middle housing is possible in the historic districts. But one of the things I'll say is when our legislature considered our statewide middle housing ordinance 4 years ago, the city of Portland and generally our preservation advocates accepted and even encouraged a statewide approach that if middle housing was required in new suburbs, if middle housing was required in older neighborhoods, it should also be required in historic districts with preservation protections applied. And so we didn't fight it. We basically said, look, this is, if the state wants to go down this way, don't take away demo review, don't take away our core protections, but the use, the middle housing use isn't scary to us.
Thanks, Brandon. The land trust question. So a land trust is a vehicle where you basically separate the ownership of the land from the ownership of the improvements on the land. And it also has mechanisms to keep what the affordability of the folks who are occupying the improvements, sort of perpetual affordability. So it really only lowers costs if someone's going to buy the land at market and then lease it to us for $1 or whatever. So that basically it takes land cost out of the cost equation for development. And I've seen lots of different conversations about land trust. I have not found that entity that wants to buy land and then basically lease it to it at a lower cost. So, but it's something I bring up Altadena again. It's a big conversation in Altadena about the use of land trusts, and there are philanthropy dollars that are helping other nonprofits that we work with, but we aren't a direct part of it in terms of doing land banking in Altadena. One of the tensions, though, is do you want to create affordable ownership, middle income ownership opportunities for folks and let them get the full value of price appreciation over time? Or do you want to keep it permanently affordable? So different nonprofits come down differently on that question. I think for us, we want folks to create wealth over time. So we're less concerned about long-term restrictions and more concerned about that initial buyer is a low, moderate, middle buyer. Thanks.
Okay, so we're at our time for now, and we're going to take a 10-minute break. So it's 3 o'clock. If everyone could take a break, stretch their legs, and come back for us starting again at 3:10, we'll have the rest of our panel come up then. Thank you. Seats if you haven't already. I'm excited to introduce our next 3 panelists for this session. We'll be hearing from representatives of the City of Sacramento, City of Berkeley, and City and County of San Francisco. Sean DeCoursey will cover our City of Sacramento's newly adopted missing middle interim ordinance. Next, Fatima Crane will discuss the City of Berkeley's middle housing zoning changes that are in the works. And then Rich Sucre will close us out with San Francisco's phased approach to infill housing development in historic districts. So now for some introductions. Sean DeCoursey serves as the City of Sacramento Historic Preservation Director, where he oversees the preservation program. He previously worked for the California Office of Historic Preservation, the California Energy Commission, and JRP Historical, and has a BA in history and an MA in public history from Sac State. Fatima Crane is an urban planner based in the East Bay and a graduate of UC Berkeley with a bachelor's degree in ethnic studies and city and regional planning. Most recently, she worked for the City of Berkeley, where she supported the Land Use and Planning Division's Cultural Resources Management Program for the last 7 years. She currently serves as the City of Richmond's Historic Preservation Commission. On the commission, the board of directors for the Crowded Fire Theater located in SF and shares leadership of the BIPOC Right Action Deep Refuge Group at the East Bay Meditation Center. Meditation Center, sorry. And Rich Sucre is the Deputy Director of Current Planning Division for the San Francisco Planning Department and serves as the lead for historic preservation. Rich has a background in architecture and architectural history, having received an architectural degree from the University of Michigan and his master's in architectural history from the University of Virginia. Rich previously worked as an architectural historian with a historic preservation architecture and planning firm, serving as a project manager and lead historian on numerous projects in California and the Western US. Since 2010, Rich has worked for the San Francisco Planning Department and has had several roles spanning historic preservation projects, planning entitlements, and long-range planning efforts. So, Sean, why don't you take us away first for the Missing Middle Housing Program?
All right, thank you, everybody. Thank you, Greta. Again, Sean DeCoursey, I'm the city's preservation director, and if you're from out of town, welcome to Sacramento. If you were at last year's conference, when it was announced that the conference was going to be in Sacramento, I heard kind of mixed reviews from the audience, but welcome, you're here. I hope that this will be a wonderful conference for you all. So I'm going to talk about the city's Missing Middle Housing Program. This is a fairly new program, much newer than the city of Portland's. And we did look to the city of Portland's program for inspiration. We also visited the city of Portland and discussed with their long-range planning team what their program looked like, the struggles they had. We also hired the same consultant that they used to help them with their missing middle housing, with our missing middle housing study, which was the first step in the process that eventually became an interim ordinance that was just adopted several months ago. This interim ordinance for our program is intended to be revised and then any kinks or issues worked out, and then a final ordinance adopted in the coming months. So one acknowledgement, unlike Portland, who has preservation in their long-range planning section, the city of Sacramento has preservation in our current planning section. And so Nguyen Nguyen, who is the planner who shepherded this project from its conception in 2022 through its adoption in 2025, is not here today. And so I'm going to present on the program. I see it from the implementation side. So we're seeing projects come in. Haven't seen that many because it's so new. We've seen more outside of historic districts that have come in, and we've been working them through the process. So that's my vantage point. But I did appreciate hearing from the Housing and Community Development about the state laws and the overview of state legislation, because when, as many of you are aware, state legislation has often carved out historic resources from some of the streamlining efforts. And when this program was first brought to me, I said, well, why don't we just carve out historic districts? And the more I learned about it, and the more I learned about sort of where we want to go with historic preservation at the local level, I realized we need to embrace housing and historic districts and landmarks and preservation programs, especially at the local level, can either be part of the solution and we can provide housing and we can have these programs operate in historic districts with effective controls, or we're going to see historic resources torn down. And so I converted, and I came to appreciate the program and came to endorse the program. And I encourage other local governments to look towards incentives like these to adopt in their communities. So let's see with that. So we heard a little bit about definition of missing middle housing and the types of missing middle housing units that are considered missing middle. So you've probably seen this graph before. It's a common graph developed by Opticos that shows sort of the missing middle housing. Essentially, it's not the single family dwellings on individual lots, and it's not large apartment buildings in city centers, but more of the housing types that you see in the middle. So this lists duplex, triplex, fourplex, courtyard apartments, bungalow courts, townhomes, multiplex, live work units, and the like. All right, so how did Sacramento approach this program? The first two bullets, if you can read them on this slide, I was having a little trouble reading all the way from the back, but I'll explain them. These are the most critical policy changes that we made to allow this program to be effective. The first, we removed density maximums in the city of Sacramento. So we updated our general plan, and this allowed us to remove all the density maximums. So in the R1 and R2 zones, we had maximums of 1 or 2 units per lot, and those requirements for units are now gone because we don't want to disincentivize multiple units on an individual lot. And then the next policy change, the second bullet, we adopted a floor area ratio designation, and I'll get into some more detail about what a floor area ratio designation is. We adopted 4 area ratio designations within our general plans. We have a map. All R1 and R2 zones have a floor area ratio calculation where that incentivizes missing middle housing, and essentially this allows for a building envelope that can be built in, but not necessarily regulates the number of units. We have a set of controls to help shape what these developments will look like. There's a 35-foot height limit in our R1 and R2 zones. We have a concept that's evolved in Sacramento known as bulk control, or the wedding cake or the tent, it's sometimes referred to, and I'll explain what that is, but essentially it provides an envelope which development can be designed within. And that is universal across all of our R1 and R2 zones. And then our historic district plans, which were adopted in 2019, they have height regulations and setback standards, which I'll show you in a moment, that apply only within historic districts, and they help govern development and how tall a building can be based on adjacent contributing resources, and then when on an alley, how far an alley development has to be from any contributing resource on the same parcel. We have setback requirements to ensure buildings don't dominate the parcel, and open space is provided. And there are tree planting requirements because it's hot in Sacramento, as you're going to experience tomorrow. I think might be the hottest day, or Friday. But we want to encourage tree plantings in missing middle housing developments. And then we're working on driveway size flexibility and trash management flexibility, which will be worked out in the interim ordinance. These are all of these topics came out of our community outreach when we talked to developers and architects, design professionals about what kinds of development restrictions were inhibiting the development of missing middle housing, in their opinion. All right, so floor area ratio. I promised you I would discuss what floor area ratio is. I had to learn this sort of the hard way as everyone started talking about floor area ratio and how we'd be adopting this. And I sort of, okay, I have my own, things we're working on. And then eventually it was like, okay, I better figure this out. So the floor area ratio is a ratio or percentage. It regulates the total building square footage that's allowed proportional to the size of the lot. So we have zones essentially that are established by the general plan where different floor area ratios are allowed. And then the developer or project proponent gets to select what the building is going to look like within that ratio. But we don't regulate what the building will look like with this formula, or most importantly, the number of units that can be developed on the parcel. So we also layered on top of this the graphic you see at the bottom, which is a sliding scale for floor area ratio, which gives a developer additional square footage that they can design in if they increase the number of units. So it's a direct incentive. The more units you propose, the more building envelope you're allowed to develop on the parcel. So 1 unit, you have a 0.4 ratio. So not a very big building, but as you can see, more units. So those little modules inside each of those units, inside each of those building envelopes is a unit. The more units you are allowed or you're providing, the higher your ratio goes up. So we eliminated lot coverage because we heard this was a sort of restrictive and duplicative concept in our regulations. We rely on setback and open space minimums to provide open space because we don't want these buildings to dominate the parcel. We want livable yet neighborhood scale developments. And our lot coverage requirement, it can be accommodated through our setback standards and open space. So this is a standard I referenced for historic districts. It provides that a building can be at 150% of the height of any adjacent contributing resource. So this will regulate within historic districts the height of any new building to 150% based on any adjacent contributing resource. That means that it's really based on the design context that you're building in. We adopted this with the help of Page and Turnbull, who worked on these plans with in 2019, just before SB 330, the Housing Crisis Act, was adopted, and we didn't know the benefit that this would have, years later. And if you may hear, I'm speaking about this in several other sessions because I did not get to speak on it thoroughly in 2020 when the pandemic happened and the conference was supposed to be here. So. But this has been an effective tool to regulate the size of new buildings in historic districts over the past 5 years. This is the other standard that was established by the Historic District Plan that I mentioned. Alley infill developments must be 30 feet away from any contributing resource on the same parcel. And so this provides for additional open space and setback from contributing buildings. In most districts, new alley infill also needs to be a minimum of 10 feet away from any adjacent contributing resource. All right, so bulk control. Let me have some notes here. Let me make sure I get this right, because bulk control typically doesn't come into play because our 150% height standard is generally the governing regulation within historic districts. So in essence, in simple terms, the higher a building goes up, the more the building volume needs to step back or be pushed back away from neighboring properties. And there's a formula involved in how high up versus how far in. That's why we call it a wedding cake, because it's sort of, wedding cake goes up and over, this same concept. The downfall of, in my opinion, the downfall of bulk control is it's a fairly complicated formula, and it really needs to be applied by a design professional in order to apply it to a given building product. So one thing we're considering is actually replacing bulk control citywide with our 150% height standard. Because as you can see, this relies on context, not the size of the lot. Bulk control is regulated by the size of the lot and how big you can build. This regulation is based on the design context that you're building in. So here is a building without bulk control. As you can see, it is bulky. And this is in a neighborhood dominated by ranch style houses. So the building wall goes straight up. It doesn't set back. The same project with, and this project with a floor area ratio of 1.5 would allow for about 12 800 square foot units. With bulk control applied, the unit count does go down by 1. The square footage of the units goes slightly up, but as you can see with gable roofs and dormers, the building is more in context with the ranch style homes around it, albeit slightly larger. I did want to mention this project did have 4 specific goals when they set out. Develop neighborhood scale housing density that's livable and attainable, empower residents to invest in their community through neighborhood scale projects, provide economic opportunity for passive retirement income and to create opportunities to house intergenerational households, and to create a reliance on local investors and builders to create the housing that can help create wealth and ownership over time. About 1/3 of our historic districts are zoned R1 and R2, so this incentive program will apply within those historic districts. But I think that through the controls that I've described, the housing types that we'll see, I hope, will be neighborhood scale and in context with our historic districts. One thing I should have mentioned at the top, our missing middle housing program remains discretionary. So all projects go through a discretionary review process. In the future, we may look at an objective process, but currently discretionary process is the way these are reviewed. So again, I don't have a lot of data like the city of Portland did, where they know how the program's working. For us, we're just getting started. We're seeing projects come in. So far, we have seen projects in historic districts go through this set of regulations and come in larger and be reduced in context with the neighborhood around them. But it remains to be seen when the final ordinance gets adopted what the regulations will look like. Thank you. I'll turn it back over to Greta.
Okay, next we will have Fatima Crane. I'm going to help you pull up this.
Hi, everyone. I'm Fatima Crane. Until recently, I was on the staff at the City of Berkeley. So today I'm here to report to you a story about Berkeley's middle housing process, but I'm not here as a representative of the city. So the City of Berkeley is contemplating changes to their municipal code in order to implement a middle housing program. In their recent housing element adoption, the City of Berkeley defined middle housing as a residential project that includes anywhere from 2 to 6 units. And why this is important is that the residents and the leadership of Berkeley have decided that Berkeley needs to produce more housing, more diverse housing, and to disperse it more broadly throughout the city. So I'll give you a brief introduction to Berkeley, talk a little bit about the history that has led to their current situation, and I'll describe the pending changes. Let's get oriented by looking at the zoning map. Berkeley is located in the San Francisco Bay Area. It's in the East Bay, and it's at the very northern part of Alameda County. The city slopes upward from the bay, which is on the west, on the left side of this image, up to the East Bay Hill Ridge. And the most famous feature of Berkeley is probably the University of California campus and the abutting South Side neighborhood. The centrally located downtown, and my favorite personal feature, Berkeley has 3 BART stations. BART is the inner city mass transit rail system, and that's unusual for a city of Berkeley's size. Here, I just want to highlight for you what the thoroughfare and arterial streets are that serve and provide circulation for Berkeley and connect it to the community. This is going to be important for us later, so maybe this image will leave an impression in your mind. And then I want to just explain a little bit about the color coding on our zoning map here. Yellow, the yellow ochre gradations represent residential housing, or sorry, residential zoning with the lowest single unit detached forms in the pale yellow, and then the higher residential densities in the ochre color. The purple, magenta, and reds represent commercial zoning, and the blues are industrial and manufacturing. All right, let's start with some history, and I'm going to go to 1973 because that was the year that the city of Berkeley adopted the Neighborhood Preservation Ordinance. This is an informative and defining regulatory practice in Berkeley. And what it did was it introduced discretion for all new construction. This is residential, commercial, anything you do in Berkeley, you got to get discretion for it. It implemented a public process to accompany discretion. So many of these discretionary reviews are done by the Zoning Adjustments Board and appealable to the City Council. Discretionary reviews that occur at the administrative level are also appealable, and thereby, through an appeal, would also have a public hearing. And so this is a robust public process. And the third thing that this ordinance did was it eliminated by right demolition. And this was important because this is one of the ways that Berkeley controlled for its policies of maintaining housing and housing units. That policy defined regulatory practice and carried us through the 80s and into the 90s, where the land use policies and practices expanded. And there was an emphasis on intensifying development in the commercial districts. And this meant channeling and encouraging development along those commercial circulatory corridors that we highlighted earlier. There was an emphasis on mixed use development. And of course, mixed use is characterized in Berkeley with ground floor commercial and stories of residential above. And these developments were transit oriented. So again, along those corridors near the downtown BART station in the high density areas that are well served by transit. Berkeley also adopted an inclusionary requirement. And this was for projects of 5 units or more that would be required to provide 20% below market rate units. And Berkeley doubled down on, again, its housing retention program. So the proposal to eliminate, convert, or any way affect a housing unit could only be approved if the housing unit were maintained and preferably if a greater number of housing units were built. So this is the framework that we're talking about in Berkeley that's carrying us into the 2000s, when in 2002, Berkeley adopted its general plan where a lot of this direction was further described in policy documents. Of course, we started to see more state density bonus invocations in Berkeley projects. So our buildings in those commercial areas are not only including more affordable units, they're also expanding and getting taller. Their building envelopes are increasing, and Berkeley adopted a South Side area plan again, intensifying development and channeling it into the South Side area adjacent to campus. In 2012, Berkeley adopted its downtown area plan. This plan upzoned the downtown, and it also envisioned and provided provisions for the development of high-rise development. So where the housing cap, the story cap throughout the city was about 4 to 5 stories. In the downtown, you could go up to 8. And in some cases, the city would even consider proposals for high-rise construction up to 18 stories. The demolition ordinance was further refined to allow for the removal and replacement, again, of any units that were rent stabilized or had long-term tenants, so long as those tenants could be made whole and tenant protections were in place. And of course, the state asked Berkeley and all jurisdictions to streamline their review process, to cut down on some of that discretionary review and to get us to affirmative actions in a faster timeframe. So what were the results of 50 years of that kind of policy and land use practice? Well, on average, Berkeley entitles approximately 575 new dwelling units every year, with about 15% of those being below market rate, and the majority of them being studios and one-bedroom apartments. And here's a statistic from the state that estimates that Berkeley's housing growth is at about 10%, which is still being outpaced by the county overall. And this is something that is agreed upon, should be not just an imperative to improve, but Berkeley has the will to improve it. So in the last couple of years, the city council has done many things. They have adopted a new updated housing element. They have rezoned the south side yet again for more intense development, and they have further refined the zoning ordinance. And these actions were taken after extensive public meetings and discussions about housing and housing policy. With the outcome of receiving the feedback that Berkeley needs to produce more housing, more affordable housing, and more diverse types of housing. So what we were seeing in those corridors and in that sort of podium style development that was popular was a lot of smaller units. And this brings us to our current situation. So again, we'll take a look at the zoning map, and this time we'll look at it as a land use pattern model. And we'll remember that a lot of our podium style dense housing is being channeled into these commercial corridors, while a vast majority of the city is remaining low scale, and we aren't seeing nearly the rates of housing production in those areas. And that gives us a situation where we've got high concentrations of apartment units, massive areas of low density, all within a context of calls for more housing, more affordable housing, more diverse housing in a regional context where we're expecting continued population growth. So this is what the city council does with that kind of momentum. In 2017, they, I would say, refined their objective development standards to be a little more objective and a little more standard. They introduced middle housing, the concept of housing that is somewhere between a detached single-family low-density model and these taller multi-story models. And they decided to do away with exclusionary zoning. And here they're defining exclusionary zoning as single-family residential zoning, which has its roots in all sorts of ways and strategies of dividing communities and keeping them separate. So they're saying, we don't need that anymore. Not only is it a bad land use model, it's not where we want to take it. So in 2023, with their housing update, they have implemented Program 29, Middle Housing. And here they are specifically trying to incentivize the construction of middle housing by creating an affordable housing fee schedule that is scaled, doing away with low-density housing in favor of middle housing and multi-units on traditionally single-family residential lots. And they are also considering allowing for the demolition by right of single-family homes when the proposal is specifically to create more housing units on those sites. So again, what is middle housing? Well, middle housing is not a single unit. It's not a 10 unit or more apartment complex. It's 2 to 6 dwelling units that fits within that very basic residential 3 to 3.5 story building envelope. Staff is preparing a recommendation to City Council based on their request, and looking very carefully at what City Council is asking for. Staff is actually estimating that this kind of model in Berkeley could yield anywhere from 4 to 7 units on a property. So what is middle housing? It is definitely infill housing. It's housing that's going to be built within those already built out areas of Berkeley. So some examples would be an existing building that is then internally subdivided to create additional units. It's new construction that still fits within this 3.5 story model. And it's some combination of both, where buildings are reused and new construction occurs. And I think the example from Portland was the model of a flag lot. So these are all possibilities that are envisioned in Berkeley's idea of middle housing. So this brings us to the pending changes. And you can imagine that the best way to achieve these changes is, well, let's talk a little bit about what's new. I just want to emphasize here for a moment. So what the goal is now is to use local regulation to incentivize greater unit yield and to reduce permitting thresholds. And I think that's one of the more remarkable outcomes of these latest efforts, is because this is a direct contrast to that 1973 ordinance that used discretion and has brought us here 50 years later, where we're still not achieving the housing goals that we want. So this is a whole new land use policy where we are eliminating discretion where possible, where feasible, and also focusing on changes to the low density zoning rules. So now we're not just targeting those commercial corridors, we're actually targeting large areas of the city. And I think I might be running out of time. So I'm going to very quickly talk about what the City Council is going to consider this summer when it takes a look at these zoning rules. The first thing it's going to do is it's going to consolidate many of those low density zoning districts. And the biggest thing, in my opinion, is that where these districts' permitting structure once required discretion for any new construction, we are going to now see, or potentially see, the creation of dwelling units by right. Secondly, we're going to increase density overall, and we're going to begin to measure it on a per acre basis rather than a per parcel basis. We're going to slightly increase the building envelope for these projects in terms of height and building footprint, known as lot coverage. We're going to relax some of the requirements for usable open space. We're going to reduce what had traditionally been 20-foot setbacks for front and rear yards to just 5 feet. And all of that's going to happen with 2 important exceptions. So I'll talk to you a little bit about the exceptions. I think you'll find them interesting. So you'll remember when we looked at the Berkeley map, we saw a lot of yellow, and we decided that those are the areas we're going to target. But in these revisions that are going to City Council this summer, you'll notice that a large yellow area of Berkeley has been excluded, and this is the hillside overlay. And that is because the City Council wants to take a pause and consider very carefully some environmental and public safety concerns about this area of Berkeley and come back to this in the future. The second exception you'll find interesting is the carve out or the exception for any properties within these districts that is locally registered as a city landmark. That's not to say that the zoning doesn't apply. The new zoning standards that allow for this, for the production of housing will apply in all of these properties. However, the design of the new construction would be subject to discretionary review by the Landmarks Preservation Commission. So we are moving toward ministerial review with some exceptions where we're retaining the consideration for discretionary review. So I was going to spend a little bit of time explaining those development standards, but I think you all understand development standards and how they're making it more permissible, slightly larger envelopes, and most importantly, getting us more dwelling units in the same properties that have traditionally only produced 1 to 2 dwelling units. So I will speed to the end of this presentation where I remind you that all of this is going back to City Council in July of 2025. The City Council will begin with the first of 2 requisite hearings in order to adopt this new ordinance. And there is broad support for moving toward ministerial review for middle housing. However, staff anticipates there may be some discussion at the City Council about the by right removal of certain single-family residences. Also, what's going before the City Council is a set of objective development standards, but they have not yet considered objective design standards. So there may be some discussion about where that is in the future. I will be watching, and I will be personally interested in learning a little bit more about the results of the evacuation study from the Hillside that is going to inform any future consideration of these changes in the Hillside District, and whether or not there is funding for a cultural resources survey of that very large swath of the city that will be affected by these changes. So that's where we are in Berkeley. Thank you so much for receiving this presentation, and thank you to the staff at Berkeley for all of your time and support.
Oh, sorry. Okay, and to wrap this up is Rich Sucre from the City and County of San Francisco.
Okay, thank you, everyone. I'm going to close you out here. Hopefully get everyone engaged to talk about the exciting world of preservation design standards, specifically for additions and modifications to historic buildings. And I want to give a quick shout out to one of my staffers who put all of this together, Rebecca Salgado, who was the primary author behind all of this, as well as the presentation, which we are giving today. So why are we working on objective design standards and the requirement for them? As you know, with the recent state laws, as we heard earlier in Kate's presentation, we are required to basically develop objective design standards per our recently passed housing element, as well as in reviewing housing policy and practice, basically HCD's review of our housing element and our kind of rules that we have in San Francisco. In short, what this basically means is the state is wanting us as the locality to define the rules upfront. And that's basically the main purpose behind most of the objective design standards. They don't want uncertainty in how a project is approved. They want to basically make sure that you as the locality define those rules very clearly for someone that is coming in. And part of this is also that the Housing Accountability Act also requires local governments to approve projects that comply with objective rules that involve no personal or subjective judgment by a public official and are uniformly verifiable by reference to an external and uniform benchmark or criterion available and knowable by both the development applicant or proponent and the public official before submittal. So in the City and County of San Francisco, this led us to adopt 2 documents, which we received successful adoption. The first was our citywide design standards, which are geared towards new construction of housing, basically projects that are subject to the HAA, or Housing Accountability Act. And then a subsequent appendix to that, which was the preservation design standards, which are specific towards additions and modifications to historic properties that are involving the construction of 2 units or more. And so we basically received adoption from the citywide standards in November of 2024. And then we recently got adoption by our planning commission in March of 2025. So the San Francisco design standards, as I mentioned, apply to projects involving 2 or more dwelling units that are subject to the Housing and Accountability Act. And specific for the preservation design standards, we're looking for new additions to existing structures or adaptive reuse projects that add basically 2 units or more. Projects that would not be subject to HAA or would not be subject to these standards would include, for example, single-family home remodels, commercial-only properties, or primarily residential, or portions of mixed-use projects that would require a conditional use or some other kind of land use entitlement. So why did we need the preservation design standards? There are currently no protection for HAA eligible projects that involve historic properties, with the exception that most of the state laws and ministerial programs that are offered provide incentives specifically for demolition, which is great, but you can obviously do a lot to a property without demolishing it in its strictest capacity. An HAA eligible project on a specific landmark could make major changes to the building, including demolishing lots of historic fabric without the city or the locality having any meaningful input onto what that looks like. In addition, it's important to note the state does not currently have a definition of demo that gets basically applied across the state, and that's an important note. We in San Francisco actually have a local definition of demo, which is quantifiable and objective in its definition. And so it's actually worked pretty successfully in how we look at our Article 10 city landmark program. And so I'm just propping it up over here on the screen, which I realize you probably can't read because it is small, but I'm sure you're going to have access to all of these slides. But the short answer is we look at basically the box that is potentially a historic building and then starting to analyze portions of how much is removed, basically ultimately defining demo in that way. So our preservation design standards include regulatory context, and a discussion about existing features, and then a discussion about site design and architecture. And we'll go into more depth on all of these topics. Within the regulatory context, and you'll see particularly for the preservation ones, we do a lot of work to talk about the applicability, how to use the guide, how do historic designation work, how does this work with contributors to district, and specifically, how does this work with character defining features? So relative to historic designations, obviously we have a kind of wide variety. I don't need to tell this audience, but we have federal, we have state, we have local designations in particular. And so each one of them obviously have different meanings relative towards these state laws. It also has different meaning on what we do locally. So for example, on our end, locally, we do special preservation entitlements for locally listed landmarks, but we do not do kind of detailed review outside of CEQA for federal or state landmarks or things that are listed within the state. In San Francisco, we define basically our designations in 3 categories. Category A, which is historic resources, and that includes about 13% of the city. We have a little subset of category A called A star. These are our local landmark districts. Basically, these are the ones that would require, for example, a certificate of appropriateness or another type of preservation entitlement called a permit to alter. That's about 1.4% of the city. Category B, which is kind of our unknown, basically it is age eligible properties, meaning they were built more than 45 years or older. And that's the majority of the city with 119,000 parcels within the city. And then category C, which is not historic, is basically how we work within the city. The purpose of the preservation design standards, obviously, is to provide design and preservation guidance for projects on existing historic projects. And we basically are trying to adopt what we do locally in a very quantifiable, if not checklist format. And I know it sounds a little rough to think in this way. Obviously, when we do work with property owners and with developers on historic properties. A lot of our work is more art than it is science. Basically, what the state is telling us to do is to become more science. It has to be a yes or no question at the end of the day. And obviously coming up with a set of rules that apply to the kind of wide range of historic resources, from brick industrial buildings to, the Painted Ladies in Alamo Square, is challenging. And also factoring in the context of constraints that the state has added into localities in terms of what can be, how you reduce development capacity or how you build from there. And so coming up with this kind of big soup of standards and then trying to apply it to our wide range of historic buildings was a big challenge. And I will snooze Steve, as well as the meeting with Jose Ruiz Benitez. So what we ended up doing was trying to really hone in and focus the standards only on category A properties, and not have them applied to category B and C. In part, the smaller focus meant that we could get kind of better support from our decision makers. It also means that we're kind of providing protections on the buildings that we know about the most. And obviously this was a pretty controversial item that went forward to both our Historic Preservation Commission and our Planning Commission, but knowing that we kind of had a smaller subset, really only 13% of the parcels, meant that we could kind of build broader support for this. Most projects that are, category A or category B are still subject to the city's kind of discretionary processes, and by also making the standards only subject to HAA eligible projects. So for example, that would include projects using the state density bonus, projects that basically are now invoking SB 423. If I didn't mention, San Francisco is the first jurisdiction in California to now use SB 423. While everyone else had a nice 5-year timeline to kind of prep and get everything ready, we had all but 1 year. As one of our president of our local preservation organization said, we were literally caught with our pants around our ankles. And it's right. Like, we basically had to kind of build a lot of these tools in place to make sure that we balance how basically we treat historic resources, how we still provide opportunities for housing, and then basically ensure that we have some level of protection for the works that we have within there. And then basically we made sure that our current standards were supplementary and complementary to the citywide objective standards that we basically have kind of instituted for the whole city. So we had kind of two parallel efforts, knowing that we had to focus on new construction first, also focus on historic resources kind of second, or I shouldn't say second, but in parallel too. We also had a strong discussion about how we treat contributors and non-contributors. And obviously the focus in our particular case was to solely focus on contributors and making sure that the preservation design standards only apply to contributors versus non-contributors. And this is something that worked obviously for our jurisdiction, but it might not necessarily work in your jurisdiction. We also had a challenge in terms of how you deal with character defining features. The issue that we ran into when looking at character defining features and is basically dealing with how the documentation is on your historic resources. Sadly, I would say is the documentation very varies. So the information that we have from the 70s and 80s is not as good as information that was produced in the last 5 years, where we have, especially in the last probably 5 to 10 to 20 years even, we would say that we have clear definition of what is historic on a building and why it is historic and for what time frame. Older designations or older information doesn't have that. So we had to come up with a formula for how we define what is character defining. And keep in mind, one of the key tenets with our preservation design standards is that you can't kick someone into a process. So remember, the issue is that if I submit a housing proposal on a historic resource, the rules have to be well defined at the time of submittal. It can't basically ask someone to basically do X, Y, and Z process or do X, Y, and Z study in addition to that. And so that becomes a challenge when you're dealing particularly with historic resources and how we have defined historic resources, because those rules are not always defined for us. So then we went into a section on existing features, and this is basically a breakdown, and I'm getting the 5-minute nod, so I'm going to kind of run through this a little bit fast, but with a hope in mind towards the end of my talk. Talking specifically about how we treat properties and basically talking about the treatment of character defining features. Just to wrap up what I was saying earlier, we basically have stated that anything that is visible within 150 feet from a public right-of-way is a character defining feature. So the developer, for example, has an option if they choose in advance of filing their application to come and talk with us, to come and help us define it for you. But the issue we have is that us as the city can't force them to do that, to basically do it. So for example, if a building has a vinyl window on it, right? If they don't want to initiate a more refined historic study of their property, that vinyl window would be considered a character defining feature for lack of information on their property. And we basically had to take very blunt rules in terms of how you treat basically a particular building or a particular site. Other things that we had to do was make sure we provide for like some clear guidance on windows. And so we came up with a great matrix that helps define what an original window would be, what a current window be, and then what we would approve in its place. We also had some nice rules on storefronts, basically. Next, we moved into site design and architecture with particular emphasis on massing and step backs. Keep in mind, one of the things that's challenging the most in terms of massing is basically your ability to basically define or reduce the buildable envelope of your property, right? So you can't basically define, preclude it or introduce too many step backs or too many rules basically within the massing realm to basically prohibit the kind of like maximum ability to build out housing, for example. So one thing you'll notice, for example, is we include a setback ratio, but we don't include a height ratio on the particular site. So we don't state how many stories you could build on top of a certain amount of units, which I know is very antithetical towards how we basically would provide advice for basically doing work on a historic property. Let's skip through facade articulation and rooftop features. To basically ensure that our implementation was clear, all of these standards were then translated into basically a checklist format, right? And so this is our way that the staff basically can look at a project and basically ensure that and state for the record, it complies, it does not comply, it needs information, and that basically kicks it back to the owner or the applicant itself. We also know that the new design standards, right? We are now experimenting with them and seeing how they're kind of landing as we apply them to projects. We are fully aware that we have to probably iterate on this fact. Nothing, I think we took a big stance that like, we don't want perfection to be the enemy of the good. And absent of any type of design standard, we have no ability to push back on the wide range of things that something could do to someone's historic property, particularly in our instance where, for example, if you are not a designated resource, right? So I am just a category A historic resource that was found to be eligible under CEQA. The city has no ability to basically push back on a project that basically meets all the uniform development standards unless we had something like this in place. And so that's been the biggest importance, is that it gives us some type of tool to at least provide some kind of input beyond what's actually in our zoning code or in our planning code, basically in this. We are fully aware that this is kind of like the first step in where we're going. So we know that we're working on and will be needing to work on, for example, design standards that are for smaller scale development. Right now, for example, we have adopted residential design guidelines. Those residential design guidelines need to be converted into residential design standards. So we basically have to hard code the things that we would normally provide, some grace on and some basically leverage to like work with an owner. We also have our cultural district program, which basically helps define a lot of the cultural communities within the city. And we know that those communities should have a voice in basically what gets built within their areas. And we also know that like our specific guidelines are right now only geared towards additions and alterations. We need to provide additional insight for basically infill new construction within our landmark districts. Our main issue on this kind of component, especially, is that our landmark districts are varied. So we have districts that are heavily industrial in nature. We have districts that are heavily residential in nature. And the same kind of standards, while we could kind of make a leap there, we found it really challenging to then provide for infill construction for some of those. And so these are all things that we're trying to take into effect. So I will just close with saying that I think this is a tool that we currently have, right? It is something that you, in your jurisdictions, can work with your staff. In our case, our own staff came up with this. We're fortunate that we have very great, we have two really great architects that work on staff with us. We also happen to have 20 preservation planners, and there was a nice team of them kind of working through this, especially taking the approach of how do we take our current guidance and basically hard code them and then start now then applying and trying to break them. We realistically know that these will only be as successful as the kind of architects get their hands on them, quite frankly. We know we need to basically see what is working and then what is not working as we kind of review these. Fortunately, right, they were adopted in March of this year. We haven't had a project come in yet that has actually even invoked them, which is okay. I'm like, we still want to basically be able to provide for housing and provide for the necessary balance between keeping and retaining historic resources, but also building for housing. But we also know that like we have to basically strike that balance and manage change accordingly and provide for the future. So thank you.
Thank you, Rich. There we go. I want to make sure that we have enough time for questions. I know we ran out at the last session. So if anyone does have questions, feel free to come up to the microphone right now. Okay, we've got one coming up.
So this is kind of a question and an observation. In the last two sessions, there's been the theme about missing middle housing and finding opportunities for infill within existing residential neighborhoods. And one of the things that strikes me about that problem is that different cities have different size lots for residential areas. And even within individual cities, there's neighborhoods that have larger lots and neighborhoods that have smaller lots. And so Fatima, you mentioned the 5-foot setbacks. I think about that in San Francisco on our really small urban lots, and I go, oh, 5 feet is pretty tiny. But so I guess I'm just asking all of you to maybe convey a little bit about how you thought about that in terms of, we have to have objective design standards, but there are different size lots in different neighborhoods and in different cities. And how do we think about infill in such a way that we don't erode the areas of the lot that allow for green space and open air and light, and then also shadow play. So.
I'll take a stab at this and we'll pass it on to my colleagues. I think that is one of the more difficult challenges you have, for example, with implementing rules that impact your development capacity too much. The state has been clear in the mandate to the jurisdictions that we locally can't overly burden the production of housing in some way. So that impacts basically the more ephemeral things that we would normally know are good for example, homes, right? We know that green space and open space is good for new residences and construction. Unless you define a very specific and quantifiable number to basically base that off of, then it becomes basically more challenging to factor in those more ephemeral qualities into the guidelines that you provide. So for example, in San Francisco, right, if you're building a new unit, you have to provide for a required rear yard of X number of percent. In most cases, it's 30%. You have to provide for open space, right, about 100 square feet per unit. is the average taken across the city. And you have to provide for exposure, which means access onto a street or an open space from the unit. And so as you look at how that works now in these formulas of applying new guidelines to them and making sure that we build quality units, that becomes the challenge, right? Is how you strike that balance between providing for too much, or some would argue is too much, or too little in certain cases. And so it's something that I think each jurisdiction kind of needs to figure out for themselves. Obviously in San Francisco, we are dense, right? Like we have lots right next to one another. Our average lot size is about 2,500 square feet or 25 by 100. So it's dense and both narrow all at the same time. So.
Bridget, I think I understood your question to be about kind of a one size fits all set of development standards for a variety of contexts, even within one jurisdiction. And I would say, yes, I'm closing my eyes and imagining some of the properties in Berkeley and some of the neighborhoods where there probably already are these sort of historically reduced setbacks that are a little bit more tight knit. And then I'm thinking of the ones that are a little bit more spaced out. And it would be nice in an ideal world to have kind of like a scaled model of development standards. And I think in Berkeley, it seems like the council's ready to take a deep breath and jump and see what happens when we apply these more radical standards across the city and what the response is from the developers and the property owners and how they envision the use of their property. So I think I heard your question. I don't know if I had an answer to it though.
Yeah, I would just add that in Sacramento, we have a process where you can deviate from an objective standard. And we've tried to push our projects down to the staff level for the most part. And then they'll go through an administrative hearing at the director level if they're deviating from any of those objective standards for an unusual size lot or just a compact development. So that's one way that we handle it.
Thank you for all your presentations. Very interesting. My question is about state density bonus law. So when somebody proposes a project with a percentage of affordable housing, they're entitled to concessions and waivers. And so how does this impact the additional building height or reduced setbacks or whatever, less open space and so on?
So the key thing that you have with the state density bonus law, two key tenets that end up coming to play. If you are invoking and using the state density bonus law, your project is then assumed to be HAA compliant, right? So you can basically waive the quantifiable objective standards that you basically have. So right now we've been given advice that they can waive specific standards, but not all of them. So right, in certain instances, if they're kind of invoking that, keep in mind state density bonus law also says that basically for eligible historic, it uses basically the same bar that we have within CEQA, that you can't basically cause a significant adverse impact to a historic resource. Otherwise, then you don't get to use it. So it is obviously a challenge in that case because you're working on these standards that are basically meant to basically, help provide that balance between new homes and basically your existing resource. And obviously they can kind of go through and waive them at the end of the day. I will say at the core, they still have to provide for affordable housing on the particular site. In general, for example, some observations, we don't see state density bonus law being used on many properties below 20 units on average. And in our case, for example, in San Francisco, we also have various levels of affordable housing, basically an affordability. So they would have to both comply with our local as well as the kind of state mandate. But I know it varies from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. So.
And I think, Rich, you explained it well, which is that a project has to be a considerable number of units in order for the density bonus to apply, right? So I'm thinking at least 10. And The ordinance as it's drafted currently, that's going to go before the City Council of Berkeley, is looking at a development yield of anywhere from 2 to 7. So it may not be a desirable or attractive option for this scenario of middle housing that's proposed in Berkeley.
We can go to the next question.
Hi, my name is Fernanda Roveri. I'm a planner, and my question is regarding the missing middle housing. So can any of you talk about how your missing middle housing rules differ from what's known as Senate Bill 9, which was passed in 2021, which allows 2-unit development on a single family lot and also urban lot splits?
Well, I think the biggest way that our missing middle housing deviates is that SB 9 doesn't apply in historic districts, while our missing middle housing does and intentionally incorporates the historic districts in the R1 zone. So though Senate Bill 9 wouldn't apply in those districts, but the missing middle incentives do.
We also, sorry, add to it, the SB, our Sacramento's missing middle allows much greater number of units to be developed on a potential site, and we allow smaller lot sizes than SB 9. Next question.
Yeah, I have a question. Can you explain why there's been such angst about the effect of historic preservation on housing development when historically designated properties are a minuscule fraction of the total built environment? I mean, we're seeing like between, I'd say under 5%. Why is there so much concentration on such a small number of built parcels?
I almost have to say, I think it's a PR issue, honestly. I do. I think, and it goes both ways. It is both the preservationists not being up to speed on the kind of rules that are in place of today, right? And a kind of over-reliance on tools that we've taken for granted, for example, like CEQA, right? Where other states are really strong about coalition building, CEQA became an easy backstop for the preservation community towards stopping a project. And obviously now we have a legislator that is kind of attacking CEQA, sadly, or diminishing it in substantial way. On the opposite side, the YIMBY, if you will, argument is that they think that all preservation is about stopping housing and stopping development, and that you can't have both housing and historic. And we all know that's not true, right? Some of our best buildings and examples incorporate historic buildings and build big. And actually, we also historically have big as well. So it's a kind of twofold question. And I think, I hate to say, I think it's this argument now that they've kind of dug in their heels to a certain degree, but I do see it as like, for me, it's a PR problem, right? Where like the two sides now want to come together closer. And obviously I see all of you in the